Arc Raiders drops you into 5 completely different locations without ever explaining what happened to each one. And if you've been curious about the full story buried in every single map, this video is going to cover all of it. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. I made this video because Arc Raiders is one of those games that quietly buries enormous amounts of world building in places most players walk right past. The 5 maps in this game are not just arenas, they are ruins. Each one used to be something. Each one has a reason it looks the way it does, and those reasons are worth understanding. The decision I made when assembling this video was to treat each map as its own story first, before connecting the dots between them. A lot of lore videos go straight to faction and timeline breakdowns, which is fine, but I wanted to walk through the physical spaces first. The industrial decay of the dam, the sand-buried streets of the city, the hollow silence of the spaceport, the fortified mystery of the Blue Gate, and the frozen secrets of Stella montis. And let the environment do the talking before anything else does. What I found when I did that was that every location has a horror story at its core. Not a supernatural one, just the ordinary horror of systems collapsing, people disappearing, and whatever was left behind slowly being consumed by something worse than neglect. Chapter 1. Dam Battlegrounds. Rust, floodwater, and the things left behind. The dam is one of the first places you encounter in Arc Raiders, and it is also one of the most quietly devastating. From a distance, it looks like a standard post-apocalyptic industrial zone. Rusting scaffolding, collapsed walkways, brown water pooling in low-lying areas, and the skeletal frames of massive water treatment systems that have long since stopped doing anything useful. But the more time you spend in this location, the more it starts to communicate something specific. This was not simply a place that got destroyed in whatever catastrophe reshaped this world. This was a place that tried very hard to survive for a long time and eventually lost. The water filtration infrastructure at the dam is particularly interesting when you look at it closely. The scale of the systems here suggests this was never just a local utility installation. The tanks, the pump housings, the network of pipes running under and through the terrain, all of it points toward a facility that was built to serve a very large population. One reading of this is that the dam was a regional water authority, possibly one of the most critical pieces of infrastructure for whatever urban center once thrived nearby. The buried city, which we will get to later, could very plausibly have depended on this facility for its water supply. If that connection holds, then the state of the dam tells you something important about the sequence of collapse in this world. The water stopped flowing long before the sand started moving. Looking at the corrosion patterns across the metal structures, there is a story of gradual deterioration being told rather than sudden catastrophe. Metal corrodes over years, not days. The kind of layered rust you see throughout the dam, dark at the base, lighter and more orange at the surface, with sections where structural integrity has visibly given way, suggests a prolonged abandonment rather than an explosive event. Whoever ran this place did not simply leave one day because an arc wave hit. The evidence points toward a slow withdrawal, a site that was progressively staffed with fewer and fewer personnel, until at some point it simply ceased to be operated at all. The flooding is another layer worth examining. The dam sits in a valley, and the water that fills the lower sections of the map is not clean water. It carries a greenish-brown tint in certain areas that suggests chemical contamination, likely from the breakdown of the treatment chemicals stored on site. Industrial water treatment facilities use enormous quantities of chlorine compounds, algicides, and coagulants, and when those systems fail, those chemicals do not simply evaporate. They leach into the surrounding groundwater and surface water over time. What this means narratively is that the dam has been poisoning its own surroundings for years. The water that was once meant to sustain life has become the thing most likely to harm it. There is evidence of multiple occupation layers at the dam. You can find signs that someone was here after the original workers left, and then someone was here after those people too. The raider presence most recently documented at this location left behind material culture that is distinctly different from the original industrial equipment. Makeshift barriers, repurposed containers converted into sleeping quarters, fire pits built in locations that would have been absurd during the facility's operational period. directly inside buildings that would have been too hazardous for open flames. This reuse tells a story about desperation and improvisation. The people who came after the engineers were not trying to run the place, they were trying to hide in it. The term raider stronghold gets used a lot to describe the dam, and that framing is technically accurate, but also somewhat misleading if taken at face value. A stronghold implies a place chosen for its strategic value, a place you want to hold and defend. The dam may have started that way for whoever first took it over after the collapse, but the condition of the current occupation suggests something that has long since stopped being a fortress. The defensive positions are deteriorated. The watchtowers, if there ever were functional ones, are collapsed or inaccessible. What remains feels less like a stronghold and more like a place people retreated to because they had nowhere else to go, and then kept staying because leaving felt even more dangerous. The machinery at the dam has a particular quality worth dwelling on. These are not small machines. The water filtration and pumping systems at this scale would have required significant engineering expertise to install and maintain. Looking at the control infrastructure, visible in certain sections, there are panel systems and relay housings that suggest a level of automation that was, at one point, fairly sophisticated. This was not a purely manual operation. Someone designed systems here that were meant to run with minimal human intervention, which paradoxically makes their failure more complete. When the automated systems lost power or lost their calibration, there was no human fallback to take over. The machines simply stopped, and without maintenance, they started to become part of the landscape. One of the more haunting details at the dam is the presence of personal effects scattered in what appear to be living spaces, abandoned bedding, personal containers, items that suggest habitation over a significant period of time. What makes this notable is the context. The dam is not a comfortable place. It is wet, it is chemically contaminated, it is structurally unstable in sections. The fact that people lived here apparently for an extended time suggests that whatever was outside the dam was worse. You do not choose to sleep in a collapsing water treatment facility unless the alternative is something you are willing to sacrifice quite a lot to avoid. The arc raids themselves have clearly impacted this location, but the nature of that impact is different from what you might expect. The most dramatic arc damage tends to be high-energy discharge events that leave very specific signatures, materials that have been fused or displaced by electromagnetic forces, areas where the ground itself has been disturbed by energy that does not behave like conventional explosives. At the dam, these signatures exist, but they are not the dominant feature of the landscape. The dominant feature is decay. This suggests that the dam experienced arc activity as one of many problems rather than as the single defining catastrophe. The infrastructure was already failing. The community was already struggling. The arc raids were, in this reading, one more thing piling onto a situation that was already deeply compromised. The geography of the dam deserves some attention because it explains certain things about how this location functioned both as infrastructure and as a contested zone. The valley setting means that the facility is naturally lower than its surroundings, which made it ideal for water management purposes. Water flows downhill, so a valley-positioned filtration plant makes operational sense, but which also makes it exceptionally vulnerable to flooding when the systems that normally manage that water flow break down. The dammed sections that give the location its name were presumably built to control water levels, and the current state of flooding strongly implies that those systems failed in ways that were never repaired. The valley became a basin, and the basin became what you see now. There is a question worth asking about who was responsible for this facility. The scale suggests government or military investment rather than private enterprise. The design philosophy of the visible infrastructure, with its standardized components and utilitarian architecture, points toward public works construction rather than corporate development. This matters because it tells you something about the institutional context in which the dam was built and initially operated. These were not profit-driven systems. They were designed with a mandate that went beyond commercial viability. That mandate presumably included some form of contingency planning for emergencies, which makes the current state of abandonment even more telling. Whatever emergency protocols existed for this facility were either never activated, or they were activated and failed anyway. The toxic quality of the water at the dam suggests something specific about the timeline of collapse. The contamination is not so severe that it has completely killed off all biological activity in the area. There is growth in the water and around it, which tells us that the ecosystem, such as it is, has had time to adapt to the chemical conditions. This kind of ecological adjustment does not happen overnight. It takes years, possibly decades. This is another piece of evidence suggesting that whatever happened at the dam happened a long time ago, and the current state of the location represents a kind of equilibrium. Not healthy, not sustainable in any meaningful sense, but stable in the way that ruins are stable when nothing is being done to either restore or further destroy them. The radar material at the dam is interesting in another respect. Among the improvised modifications and makeshift habitation, there are signs of an organizational structure. The layouts of certain areas suggest deliberate decision-making about space allocation. Some zones appear to have been cleared and maintained with more care than others, which implies a hierarchy of some kind. Someone was making decisions here about what mattered and what did not. This is not the chaos of pure desperation. This is a community, a small, struggling, probably violent one, but a community nonetheless, with its own internal logic and its own rules about how the space worked. Looking at the specific locations where arc activity is most concentrated at the dam, an interesting pattern emerges. The damage is not uniformly distributed across the site. It clusters in specific areas, particularly around the larger tank structures and in the open spaces between buildings. This clustering could be coincidental, but one possible reading is that the configuration of metal and water at this site created conditions that attracted or amplified arc energy. Large metal structures and bodies of water can interact with electromagnetic phenomena in specific ways. And if arc raids involve some form of electromagnetic discharge, the dam may have been particularly exposed simply because of what it was built from and what it contained. The chemical storage areas at the dam are some of the most physically dangerous parts of the location, and also some of the most narratively rich. The containment systems for treatment chemicals have clearly been breached in multiple places. Drums and tanks that should have been sealed are now open, either from structural failure, deliberate intervention, or arc damage. But what is interesting is the evidence that some of those breaches were made deliberately, not by arc, by people. Marks on certain containers suggest forced entry or intentional puncturing. The question of why someone would do that, why you would deliberately release toxic industrial chemicals into an already degraded environment, opens a window onto the kinds of choices being made in this location under whatever pressures applied at the time. The water at the dam is not uniformly flooded. There are sections of the facility that remain relatively dry, elevated above the baseline water level, and these areas show a different kind of deterioration. Dust rather than rust, dry rot rather than water damage. This topographic variety within the site creates a cross-section of different collapse processes happening simultaneously. In the flooded lower sections, the machinery is corroding and biological growths are taking hold. In the dry upper sections, the materials are desiccating and crumbling. The whole facility is decaying, but it is doing so at different rates and through different mechanisms depending on where you are within it. There are structural elements at the dam that appear to have been modified after the facility stopped functioning as designed. Pipes that have been rerouted, possibly by hand, barriers erected in positions that would only make sense for crowd control or conflict rather than for water management. Markings on surfaces that suggest different occupying groups have claimed and reclaimed certain areas. The palimpsest quality of the dam, the sense that many different hands have touched this place and left their marks on it, is one of its defining characteristics, and it points toward a long history of contested occupation rather than a single moment of abandonment. The presence of specific types of industrial debris tells its own story. At the dam, you can find remnants of maintenance equipment, spare parts caches, the detritus of a functional workforce that was clearly present at some point with the intention of maintaining the facility long-term. The existence of spare parts implies that someone, at some point after the initial infrastructure was built, was still committed to keeping it running. This is a meaningful detail because it pushes back against the narrative of sudden abandonment. The dam was not left overnight. It was maintained, then less maintained, then barely maintained, and then not at all. The spare parts sitting unused in their storage areas mark the moment when the people doing maintenance stopped coming, but before anyone had arrived to take those materials for other purposes. The Ark Raiders who enter the dam to scavenge and fight represent yet another layer of the location's ongoing story. Their presence in the facility is not neutral. When you move through the dam as a raider, you are participating in a process of further extraction and disruption that is, in a small way, continuing the decline of a place that never had a chance to recover. The dam was built to keep people alive, and in a roundabout way it still is, not by providing clean water, but by providing something worth fighting over, which in this world might be the next best thing. Moving deeper into the dam's narrative, the industrial architecture gives clues about the era of its construction. The design language of the structures, the functional brutalism of the main processing buildings, the utilitarian lines of the supporting infrastructure, places the construction in a period of industrial ambition that believed in the permanence of engineered solutions to human needs. Whoever built this place believed it would last. They built it with materials meant to endure, with systems designed for decades of operation. The gap between that intention and the current reality is a kind of quiet tragedy that the visual environment communicates without ever needing to say it directly. The dam also tells a story about labor. Large-scale industrial infrastructure of this kind requires enormous human effort to build and maintain. The equipment here speaks to the work of many people over many years. When you look at the maintenance records visible in certain control areas, the safety certifications posted in certain corridors, the equipment logs and operational notices that remain legible in protected locations, you are seeing the traces of a working life. People came here every day. They had jobs, responsibilities, and routines. They knew how the machines worked and what the machines were for. And then, at some point, they stopped coming. The routines ended. The safety certifications expired without renewal. The operational notices became irrelevant. The question of what specifically triggered the final abandonment of the dam is one of those puzzles that the game's environmental storytelling raises without definitively answering. Several possibilities present themselves. An arc raid that damaged the most critical systems beyond the ability of the remaining workforce to repair. A decision by whatever organization was responsible for the facility that the cost of continued operation outweighed the benefit. A gradual attrition of the workforce through relocation, death, or the breakdown of the social infrastructure that kept people at their posts. Or some combination of all of these, unfolding over a period long enough that no single moment can be identified as the end. The way vegetation has reclaimed certain parts of the dam is notable for what it says about the local climate and ecology. Plants do not grow in chemically saturated environments unless they have adapted to those conditions. The particular types of growth visible at the dam are hardy, low-growing, and clearly thriving in conditions that would challenge most plant life. This ecological adaptation is one of the most honest things the location shows you about how long the collapse has been underway. Evolution does not work on short timescales. Plants that can survive in this chemically degraded, water-saturated environment are plants that have had time to find their footing. The dam has not been empty for months. It has been empty for a very, very long time. The arc damage signatures at the dam, when examined alongside the wider deterioration, suggest something about the frequency and intensity of arc activity in this region. The damage is consistent with repeated exposure to arc energy over time rather than a single catastrophic event. This matters because it suggests the dam was in the path of arc raids on multiple occasions, which would have progressively worsened the structural situation even if the raids themselves never delivered a killing blow. Each wave of arc activity weakened the structures a little more, disrupted whatever maintenance efforts were still being made, and accelerated a decline that was already underway. The eastern sections of the dam show signs of a fire that occurred at some point after abandonment. Burn patterns on surfaces, heat-damaged metal, carbonized material in areas that should have been fireproof given their original function. Fires in industrial locations after they have been repurposed as raider habitation are not surprising. Cooking, heating, light, but the scale of this particular fire suggests it was not a controlled burn. Something went wrong here, whether through accident or conflict. The fire left a section of the facility even more compromised than the rest, and the evidence of the burn sits atop the evidence of everything that came before it, adding one more layer to a landscape of accumulated damage. The control infrastructure at the dam is one of the most interesting archaeological features of the location. The control rooms represent a snapshot of the facility's operational state at some point in its past. The interfaces, the display panels, the monitoring equipment, all of it frozen in a moment of non-use. What is particularly interesting is the state of the displays themselves. Some are completely dark and unresponsive. Others retain residual power in a way that suggests the electrical grid connected to them has not entirely failed, which would be remarkable given the overall condition of the site. Whether this residual power is meaningful, and what it might be powering or monitoring, is a question the environment raises, but declines to answer. The relationship between the dam and the surrounding landscape is worth considering. The facility did not exist in isolation. The infrastructure connecting it to other parts of the region, pipelines, access roads, communication lines, all radiates outward from the central facility. Following those connections, even in their degraded state, gives you a sense of how integrated this place once was into a wider system of human habitation and resource management. The roads that once brought maintenance workers and supplies now lead to other ruins or to nothing at all. The pipelines that once carried treated water to distant communities now leak their contents into the local environment. The connections still exist, but they connect nothing to nothing anymore. The specific configuration of the raider habitation at the dam raises questions about conflict. The defensive elements, even in their deteriorated state, were clearly positioned in response to threats from specific directions. The barriers face certain ways. The elevated positions that would have made good observation points show signs of use. Whatever threats the raiders at the dam were concerned about, they came from predictable directions, which implies an ongoing conflict rather than a random danger. They were watching for something specific. They knew where the threat would come from. The question is what that threat was. Other human groups, arc activity, something else entirely. And the environment alone cannot fully answer that. The size of the raider occupation at the dam, judging by the material evidence, was never very large. The habitation areas, even accounting for degradation and damage, do not suggest a community of more than a few dozen people at most. This is a small group trying to survive in a very large facility. The mismatch between the scale of the infrastructure and the scale of the human occupation has a kind of melancholy to it. This facility was built to support a regional population of hundreds of thousands. The last people to call it home numbered perhaps 30. The dam's industrial decay communicates a very specific kind of failure, not the failure of individual people, but the failure of institutions. The people who built this place, who designed its systems and wrote its operational procedures and maintained its certifications, did everything right within the world they understood. The failure came from outside their control. Whatever collapsed in this world, whatever sequence of events led to the arc raids and the broader societal breakdown, the dam's systems were designed to outlast normal disruption. They outlasted it for a while, and then they did not, and there was nothing left of the institution that built them to notice or care. As you move through the final sections of the dam, the layering of stories becomes almost archaeological. The foundation layer is the original facility, built with industrial purpose and civic intent. On top of that, the first abandonment, the period when the professional workforce left and before anyone else arrived. Then the raider occupation, itself a layered story of multiple groups coming and going. Then the arc activity that progressively degraded everything. And on top of all of that, the current contested zone, where the material remains of all previous occupations have become scavenging grounds and battlefields. The dam is not one story. It is at least half a dozen stories compressed into the same physical space. The water itself at the dam is doing something interesting from an ecological standpoint. The contaminated pools and flooded sections are not simply dead water. There are biological processes underway in them. Strange ones given the chemical composition, but biological processes nonetheless. Life has found a way to adapt to the specific chemistry of this environment. This speaks to the resilience of biological systems in general, but it also speaks to the specificity of the dam's collapse. The contamination here has its own particular signature, and the life adapted to it carries that signature. In a way, the organisms thriving in the dam's toxic water are living records of what chemicals were used here and how they degraded over time. The dam's story is ultimately a story about systems, interconnected systems that depended on each other in ways that were not always visible until they started to fail. The water treatment depended on power. The power depended on supply chains and maintenance. The maintenance depended on human labor and institutional support. The institutional support depended on a functioning society with resources to allocate and priorities to set. When the society began to fracture, the institutional support weakened. When the institutional support weakened, the maintenance declined. When the maintenance declined, the power systems began to fail. When the power failed, the water treatment stopped. And when the water treatment stopped, a whole cascade of secondary consequences began. The contamination, the flooding, the ecological degradation that none of the original designers had planned for. The last detail worth noting about the dam before moving on is one of the smallest and most specific. In certain areas of the facility, you can find operational manuals and technical documents in various states of preservation. Some are completely unreadable, destroyed by water or time, but a few are partially legible. And what they describe is a facility that had procedures for almost every contingency the original designers could imagine. Emergency shutdown protocols, chemical spill response procedures, evacuation routes, backup power sequences. All of this documentation represents an enormous amount of institutional effort directed at anticipating failure and having a plan for it. The fact that the dam is in the state it is today is not because no one thought about how it might go wrong. It is because the actual failure was not among the possibilities they had planned for. What we are left with at the dam is a space that carries the weight of everything it was supposed to be. It was supposed to provide clean water to a large population. It was supposed to be maintained indefinitely by institutions with the resources and the mandate to keep it running. It was supposed to be an example of what human engineering could accomplish in service of human need. Instead, it is a toxic ruin where desperate people fought over scraps in the shadow of rusting machines that no one knows how to fix anymore. That gap between intended purpose and actual outcome is the core horror of the dam, and it is a quiet horror, one that does not announce itself with dramatic imagery, but that accumulates over the time you spend in the location until it becomes simply impossible to ignore. The dam is also worth understanding as a precursor to what comes next in the Ark Raiders world. If this facility represents the breakdown of essential infrastructure, water in this case, then the downstream effects of that breakdown would have shaped the circumstances of every other location in the game. Cities without water die. Communities without clean water retreat toward wherever water can be found, even if that means increasingly desperate and violent competition for it. The contamination of the dam's water supply did not just end the facility, it may have set in motion a sequence of events that contributed to the abandonment and eventual burial of the city that depended on it, which is exactly where we are going next. Chapter 2. Buried City. The metropolis that time swallowed. There is something about the buried city that gets under your skin in a way that most game environments do not quite manage. It is not just that it is ruined. Most post-apocalyptic settings are ruined. It is that it is buried. The sand has not simply accumulated around the edges of this place. It has moved through it, filled it, climbed its buildings, and in some sections, covered them entirely. The city is being consumed from the outside in, and the process has been going on long enough that the sand feels permanent now, not like something that arrived, but like something that was always going to be there. The first thing worth understanding about the buried city is what kind of city it was before the sand came. The structural vocabulary of the buildings, the density of the apartment blocks, the scale of the commercial zones, the layout of the plazas and pedestrian corridors all point toward a densely populated urban environment that valued walkability and mixed-use development. This was not a sprawling, car-dependent city. It was a city built around communal space, around the idea that large numbers of people living close together needed shared environments to function as a community. The plazas are too big and too carefully positioned relative to the residential buildings to be accidental. Someone planned this city with a specific vision of urban life in mind. The sand itself is a critical piece of evidence about what happened to this region. Sand migration on this scale does not occur randomly. It requires specific conditions, the loss of vegetation that would otherwise anchor the soil, prevailing wind patterns that move material in consistent directions, and a landscape that has been altered sufficiently that the normal barriers to sand migration have been removed. One reading of the buried city's situation is that the environmental collapse in this region preceded the ark raids by a significant margin. The desertification was already underway. The vegetation was already dying. The sand was already moving. The ark raids, when they came, arrived in a region that was already in serious ecological trouble. The crumbling apartment blocks in the buried city tell a very specific story about how cities actually die. Buildings do not collapse suddenly in the absence of catastrophic forces. They deteriorate over years, losing pieces of their exteriors first, then suffering structural weakening in the load-bearing elements, then eventually yielding to gravity in sections. The collapse patterns visible in the buried city's residential areas are consistent with long-term neglect rather than sudden impact events. These buildings were not blown up or knocked down by arc energy, at least not primarily. They fell apart because no one maintained them, and no one maintained them because there was no one left to do the maintaining. The shopping mall structures in the buried city are one of its most poignant features. Shopping malls in a functional society are destinations, places people go voluntarily with disposable income to participate in commerce and social interaction. The architectural aspiration embedded in the mall design is visible even in its current state, in the remains of what were once covered walkways between anchor stores, in the layout of what were clearly retail corridors, in the positioning of what appear to be food court areas with their distinctive circular or hub-and-spoke layouts. All of that aspiration is now buried or crumbling or half-filled with sand. The contrast between what the space was designed to evoke and what it currently is could not be more complete. The vertical environment of the buried city is one of its most distinctive gameplay characteristics, and it is also narratively meaningful. This is a city built upward, with tall apartment blocks creating canyons of built space, with elevated walkways and overpasses connecting structures at height, with rooftop areas that in functioning times were probably accessible and used as communal or commercial space. The density this implies is significant. This was not a low-rise city. It was a city that had grown upward because it had run out of room to grow outward, or because the urban planning of the era favoured density, or both. The population that once lived here would have numbered in the hundreds of thousands at minimum, and possibly significantly more. The plazas of the buried city are particularly interesting spaces because of their scale relative to the surrounding architecture. In a functioning city, plazas serve multiple purposes. They provide open air in dense urban environments. They create gathering spaces for public events and daily social interaction. They mark important civic or commercial nodes within the urban fabric. The plazas here are large enough to suggest the city took these functions seriously. They were not afterthoughts in the urban design. They were central features, planned carefully and presumably once busy and alive with the ordinary activity of urban life. Now they are the lowest points of the urban topography, which means they are the most thoroughly filled with sand. What the sand has done to the buried city's street level is particularly fascinating from a narrative standpoint. In the lower sections, where sand has accumulated most deeply, the visual reference point for navigation is no longer the street. It is somewhere above what used to be the street, somewhere in the middle of what used to be the ground floor of buildings. This means that anyone moving through the lower city now is effectively walking through space that was once interior, through what were once lobbies, retail floors, pedestrian underpasses. The boundary between inside and outside has been erased by the sand, creating a strange hybrid environment that is neither fully one nor the other. The arc damage in the buried city has a different character from the arc damage at the dam. At the dam, arc activity was one layer among many. Here, there are sections of the city where the arc damage is clearly the most dominant feature of the visual environment. Buildings that show the signature of high-energy discharge events. Structures that have been fused or deformed in ways that are inconsistent with conventional collapse or decay. Arc energy has left a more prominent signature here than anywhere else, which suggests either greater proximity to arc raid paths or greater susceptibility because of the metal-dense urban infrastructure, or both. The human story of the buried city's abandonment is harder to read than the human story of the dam, because there are fewer personal effects and less evidence of prolonged habitation after the official population left. This is interesting in itself. It suggests that the buried city was not a place where survivors sheltered for very long after whatever drove people out. Either the conditions were too harsh from the beginning, the sand, the ark activity, the collapse of essential services, or the departure was organized and relatively rapid, with people leaving as a group rather than staying behind in small numbers. The lack of raider-style habitation is conspicuous. Why did no one make a home in the ruins of this city, the way people made a home in the ruins of the dam? One possible answer to that question is the sand itself. A building that is actively being filled with sand is not a stable shelter. The weight of accumulated sand can compromise floors, block exits, create sudden shifts that make interior spaces dangerous. If the sand migration in the buried city is ongoing rather than historical, if the sand is still moving, still filling, still accumulating, then the city is not a safe place to settle. It is a place that is in the process of being eliminated from the landscape. You can hide in a ruin. You cannot comfortably hide in a ruin that is being buried while you are standing in it. The shopping mall sections of the buried city deserve closer examination because of what they tell you about the era of the city's peak. The commercial architecture here reflects a specific period of consumer society, one that invested heavily in covered retail environments, in spaces designed to keep shoppers inside for extended periods, in the particular aesthetic of aspirational consumption. The quality of the materials in these structures, even in their degraded state, suggests significant economic investment. This was not a struggling city. It was a prosperous one, at least at the point when the malls were built. The commercial confidence embedded in that architecture makes its current state more striking. The rooftop environments in the buried city offer a different perspective on what happened here. At the rooftop level, above the sand line, you get a clearer view of the city's original skyline and the distribution of damage across it. From up here, the pattern of arc damage becomes more readable. You can see the angles from which energy came, the paths that different raids seem to have taken through the urban environment, the way certain building clusters seem to have absorbed more damage than others, while adjacent structures survived relatively intact. The rooftops are also the parts of the city that feel most exposed, most vulnerable to whatever is still happening in the sky above this location. The cultural artifacts visible in the buried city, the signage that remains legible, the design elements on building facades, the urban furniture in public spaces, all contribute to a portrait of a society that was recognizably modern in its organization and consumption patterns. This is not a medieval city or a primitive settlement. This was a city that looked, at some point not too long ago, recognizably like a city you might have walked through in your own world. That proximity, the sense that this was not a distant fictional civilization, but something that mirrors recent memory, is part of what makes its destruction land with such weight. The underground sections of the buried city are worth paying attention to, even though they are often overlooked in favor of the more visually dramatic above-ground environments. Beneath the urban surface, there are infrastructure systems that tell their own story. Transit tunnels, utility corridors, maintenance access ways, all of which have been affected by the sand infiltration above them in ways that speak to the extent of the burial. Sand is moving not just across the surface of the city, but down into it, finding paths through damaged structures and working its way into the underground systems. This is not a process that stops. It is a process that accelerates as the surface structures that once blocked sand infiltration continue to deteriorate. The way human remains are absent from the buried city is one of the most important pieces of evidence about what happened to its population. Post-catastrophe environments that were abandoned suddenly through volcanic eruption, flooding, or other fast-moving disasters tend to contain human remains in significant numbers. The buried city does not, or at least the evidence does not strongly suggest it does. This points toward an organized departure rather than a sudden death event. People left this city. They chose to leave, were forced to leave, or were directed to leave by whatever authorities were still functioning at the time of the evacuation. They were not caught by whatever happened. They saw it coming with enough time to get out. The question of where they went is one that the buried city raises without answering. A city of this size would have had a substantial evacuation logistics challenge. Hundreds of thousands of people do not move quietly. They need transport, they need destinations, they need resources along the route. The scale of what would have been required to move this city's population is enormous, and the fact that the process apparently succeeded, that people did leave, that the city was emptied rather than destroyed while inhabited, implies a level of organizational capacity that seems remarkable given the circumstances. Whatever institutions managed this evacuation did something extraordinarily difficult under extraordinarily bad conditions. The arc damage patterns in the buried city suggest something about what the raiders' targets were. Not all buildings are equally damaged. The damage concentrates in certain zones, areas that appear, based on their position in the urban layout and the scale of their structures, to have been important nodes of commerce, communication, or civic function. The interpretation this points toward is that arc activity, whether intentional or coincidental, hit the most functionally significant areas of the city hardest. The systems that would have been most critical for organizing a response to any kind of disaster, communications infrastructure, administrative centers, logistical hubs, appear to have taken disproportionate damage. This would have made any organized response significantly harder. The texture of the sand in the buried city is not uniform. In areas closer to the outer edges of the map, it is finer and more wind-blown, consistent with recent or ongoing deposition. In the deeper inner sections, it is more compacted, layered with organic material and debris, in ways that suggest longer accumulation. This stratigraphic quality, the sand as a record of time, is one of the more scientifically interesting aspects of the location. Each layer of the sand deposit represents a period in the burial process. The deepest layers are the oldest. The most recent layers are at the top. Reading the sand is, in a very real sense, reading the history of the city's disappearance. The empty spaces in the buried city, not the sand-filled spaces, but the genuinely open spaces, the places where rooms are still intact and interiors are still accessible, carry a very particular quality. These spaces are preserved in a kind of accidental time capsule by the surrounding sand, protected from the wind and rain that would normally accelerate decay. In these pockets, the preservation state of certain materials is remarkable. Things that should have deteriorated long ago are still recognizable. This accidental preservation is one of the most valuable aspects of the buried city for anyone interested in reconstructing what this place was like before the collapse. The sand, which has been destroying the city, has also been protecting pieces of it. The commercial spaces in the buried city, when you can access them, tell a story about the specific moment of departure. There are inventory remnants in retail areas that suggest a rapid shutdown, not a planned closure with methodical stocking down and inventory clearance, but a sudden stop. Whatever process led to the evacuation of this city did not give people time to tidy up after themselves commercially. The shops were left mid-operation, in at least some cases, which is exactly the kind of evidence that points toward a departure that, while organized enough to get people out, was not leisurely enough to allow for the kind of deliberate clearance you would associate with a planned closure. The positioning of the buried city relative to the prevailing wind patterns in this region is meaningful for understanding the sand situation. The sand is not coming from everywhere. It has a directionality to it, which means the burial is not symmetrical. Certain faces of buildings have accumulated more sand than others. Certain streets are more thoroughly filled than the streets running perpendicular to them. The city is being buried by sand moving predominantly from one direction. And that means the parts of the city that face into the wind are the most buried, while the parts sheltered behind them are the least. This asymmetry gives the location a kind of geological texture that makes it feel like a real place undergoing a real process, rather than a designed game environment. The electrical infrastructure of the buried city is one of the more poignant aspects of the environment when you examine it closely. The power grid, the transformers, the distribution lines, the substation components visible in certain areas was clearly extensive and complex. This was a city with modern electrical infrastructure, which implies a level of technological development consistent with a society quite similar to our own. The physical remains of that infrastructure now serve as something close to the structural skeleton of the city's ruins, with electrical components becoming landmark features in an environment where everything else has been either buried or collapsed. The wires that once carried power to apartment windows and commercial signage now serve as the only connectors between buildings that are otherwise isolated islands above the sand. The signage remaining in the buried city is one of the most direct windows into the culture that inhabited it. Advertising materials, directional signage, public information displays, all of these carry traces of the city's communicative culture. The visual design language of the signage places this city within a recognizable modern aesthetic tradition, one that borrowed from international design conventions while incorporating local inflections. The specific content of legible signage, where it can be made out, points toward a consumer culture, a culture of mobility and choice, a culture that invested heavily in the visual communication of commercial and civic messages to its inhabitants. All of that communication now addresses an audience that is gone. The military or defensive installations visible in certain sections of the buried city are interesting because they appear to be additions rather than original features of the urban plan. Barriers, emplacements, and fortification elements that have been added to existing civilian structures at points that suggest a conversion from peacetime to conflict time use. This implies that at some point in the city's final period it was being defended. Someone was trying to hold this space against something. The defensive additions are not consistent with a city that was simply evacuated quietly. They are consistent with a city that, at some point, was fighting to survive. The interpretation this opens up is that the evacuation of the buried city was not a smooth, orderly process, but a contested one. There was a period, possibly a significant one, during which some people were still here trying to hold things together, while others were already leaving. The defensive additions to civilian buildings could reflect either an external threat, arc raids, other human groups, or an internal one, conflict between different factions within the city about what to do and when to go. The city's population, in this reading, did not leave together. It fragmented, argued, fought, and eventually dispersed in a process that was far messier than a clean evacuation narrative would suggest. The playground equipment visible in residential areas of the buried city is one of the most effective pieces of environmental storytelling in the entire game. It requires no interpretation. A playground filled with sand rusting in the shadow of crumbling apartment blocks communicates something about loss in an almost unbearably direct way. Children lived in this city. They played in these spaces. The same spaces are now contested battlegrounds in a game about survival and extraction. The playground equipment does not represent childhood in a metaphorical sense. It represents the specific, literal fact that the people who left this city included families, and that those families left behind the infrastructure of the lives they were trying to build. The sound design that the environment implies, the way the sand moves through certain spaces, the creaking of structures under accumulated weight, the absence of the sounds that a living city would have produced, is part of what makes the buried city such an effective piece of environmental storytelling. Silence in a space built for noise is its own form of communication. This was a city built around human activity, around the constant ambient sound of thousands of people going about their lives. The silence that has replaced that activity is not neutral. It is the sound of absence, and absence in a space built for presence is profound. The relationship between the buried city and the other locations in Ark Raiders becomes clearer the longer you spend in this environment. The dam that may have supplied its water, the spaceport that may have handled its most ambitious departures, the research facilities in the mountains that may have been working on solutions to whatever the city was facing. All of these connections are suggested rather than stated, but the scale of the buried city makes it a natural gravitational center for the region's story. This was the largest human settlement in the area. Whatever happened to this city set the terms for everything else that followed. The sand has a quality of finality about it that the other forms of damage in Ark Raiders do not quite replicate. Fire damage can be rebuilt over. Structural collapse can be cleared. Arc damage, whatever it involves, leaves scars rather than permanent burial. But sand burial is different. The sand is not a scar. It is a covering. The buried city is not a ruined city in the conventional sense. It is a city in the process of ceasing to be a city, transitioning into geological feature. The buildings are becoming landforms. The streets are becoming valleys in a new topography. The city is not dead. It is being digested, and the digestive process will, on a long enough timescale, eliminate every trace of what it was. The political implications of a major city's abandonment in the context of the Ark Raiders world are worth thinking about. Cities are not just collections of buildings and people. They are concentrations of power, resources, and institutional capacity. When a city is abandoned, the institutions that were based there do not necessarily cease to exist. They move, they reorganize, they attempt to maintain their authority in new conditions. The question of what happened to the institutions of the buried city after it was evacuated is one that the environment raises without answering. Did the government of this city reconstitute itself somewhere else? Did the corporations and commercial entities that operated here move their operations to other locations? Did the city's institutional fabric simply dissolve along with its population? The archaeology of the buried city is still, in a sense, ongoing. The sand that has buried this location is also preserving it, and the things that the sand is preserving include records, artifacts, and physical evidence that could tell an enormous amount about what this place was and what happened to it. From an in-world perspective, the question of whether anyone is interested in recovering that information, whether there are people in the Ark Raiders world who want to know what the buried city's archive might contain, is a live one. The evidence that certain areas of the city appear to have been accessed recently, with sand displaced and debris moved in ways inconsistent with natural processes, suggests that someone is indeed interested. Someone is looking for something in this city, and they are looking in the areas most likely to have preserved institutional records. The vertical nature of the combat environment in the buried city, the rooftop engagements, the multi-story interior fights, the elevated walkways, reflects something real about how this space would have been used by survivors trying to navigate it. Ground level is the most dangerous level, because it is the most buried, the most structurally compromised, and the most likely to offer ambush points. Elevation offers visibility, which in a contested environment is survival currency. The tactical logic of the environment reflects the tactical reality of post-collapse urban survival. Height is safety. Ground level is exposure. The buried city's identity as a former metropolis, a place that was definitively, unmistakably a major urban center rather than a town or a facility, gives it a different emotional register from the other Ark Raiders maps. The dam, the spaceport, the research facilities, these are all places with specific functional identities. But a city is not a functional space in the same way. A city is where people lived. It is where the ordinary texture of daily life happened. The commutes, the shopping, the children growing up, the restaurants and parks and schools and hospitals. The loss of those things is a different kind of loss from the loss of a water treatment plant or a spaceport. The buried city represents, more directly than any other location in the game, the loss of ordinary life. And that is the hardest thing to look at. The ongoing Ark raids over the buried city are visible from within the location, in the sense that Ark activity continues to affect this area even as the city is buried beneath sand. The juxtaposition is striking. The sand burial is a slow geological process. Ark raids are fast, energetic, immediate. The city is being destroyed simultaneously by one of the slowest forces in the natural world and one of the most rapid and violent ones. These two processes have produced a location that is, in a very particular sense, being attacked from multiple directions at once, from above by arc energy and from the sides and below by the encroaching sand. Whatever remains of the buried city is under siege from forces that operate on completely different timescales, and neither force is showing any signs of stopping. Chapter 3. Asera Spaceport, the last civilization that looked up. The Asera Spaceport feels different from every other location in Ark Raiders, and it feels different for a reason that goes beyond aesthetics. The other locations in this game are about things that happened on the ground. Water systems failing, cities being abandoned, research being conducted, mountains being fortified. Asera was about something that happened in the sky. This was a place built around humanity's most ambitious project, the project of leaving the planet, and the scale and configuration of the infrastructure here reflects the seriousness with which that project was pursued. The emptiness of the spaceport is therefore a different kind of emptiness from the emptiness of the dam or the buried city. This is not just the emptiness of abandonment. This is the emptiness of an ambition that stopped. The first thing you notice about Asera when you move through it is the scale. The hangars are enormous, Not enormous in the way that industrial buildings are enormous, but enormous in the way that aerospace infrastructure is enormous, designed to accommodate objects so large that normal architectural scale simply does not apply. The launch pads, visible from multiple points within the location, communicate the same thing. These structures were built to support vehicles that dwarf conventional aircraft. The spatial experience of moving through Asera is dominated by this quality of disproportionate scale, and it creates a consistent feeling of human smallness, not in a mystical sense, but in a very practical one. You feel small at Asera because the buildings were designed for machines, not people. The runway infrastructure at Asera tells a story about the scale of operations that once occurred here. Aircraft runways of the length visible in certain sections of the map are not built for conventional commercial aviation. They are built for heavy lift vehicles, for vehicles that need enormous amounts of pavement to build the speed and provide the abort distance required for safe operation. The investment represented by runway infrastructure of this length and quality is enormous. This is not a regional airport that happened to get into the space business. This is a dedicated aerospace facility, purpose-built for the specific demands of space launch operations, with every piece of infrastructure scaled to those demands. The assembly halls at Asera are one of its most fascinating spaces because of what assembly implies. Space launch vehicles are not manufactured at a single facility. They are assembled, brought together from components manufactured at many different locations, and integrated into the final vehicle at the launch site. The assembly halls here are scaled for that process, with internal volumes and material handling systems appropriate for integrating very large structures. This means Asera was not just a launch site, it was the final destination in a supply chain that extended across potentially a very wide geographic area. Components were coming here from elsewhere, being assembled into something that would leave Earth entirely, and that supply chain connected Asera to a much larger world than the ruins around it might suggest. The military character of the Asera spaceport is impossible to miss. The security infrastructure, the defensive positioning of certain structures, the presence of hardened facilities built to military specifications rather than civilian ones. All of this indicates that this was not a purely civilian aerospace operation. This was a facility where military interests were deeply embedded in the operational structure. Whether this reflects the era's typical relationship between military and space programs, or something more specific to this world's political situation, is a question the environment raises. But the dual civilian-military character of the facility matters because it tells you something about what was being launched from here, and why the security measures were as extensive as they clearly were. The desolation of Asera is different from the desolation of the other locations. The dam is desolate, but inhabited, or was recently inhabited. The buried city is desolate, but densely ruined. Asera is desolate in an expansive way, with large open spaces of cracked asphalt and concrete that were designed to be functional surfaces rather than comfortable ones. The aesthetic of a spaceport is inherently inhospitable to casual human presence. These are spaces designed to be traversed, not inhabited. The runway, the apron areas around the launch pads, the open taxiways, all of these are functional surfaces that serve specific operational purposes and have no other use. In their abandoned state, they become one of the most desolate surfaces you can walk across because there is nothing there to decay or grow or change. Just cracked concrete, slowly losing the battle against weather and time. The high-tech debris scattered across Asera is one of its most narratively interesting features. The components visible throughout the facility represent an enormous range of aerospace technology, from the mundane maintenance equipment that would be found at any large aircraft facility to genuinely specialized components that speak to the specific nature of the operations conducted here. Some of this debris is consistent with conventional aerospace operations, jet engines, avionics components, structural elements from aircraft and ground support vehicles, but other pieces are less conventional, pointing toward propulsion technologies and structural designs that go beyond atmospheric aviation into the domain of space operations. The debris field at Asera is, in a real sense, an inventory of this world's technological achievements scattered across the ground in pieces. The launch pads at Asera represent the functional heart of the facility's purpose, and their current state is one of the most poignant aspects of the location. A launch pad is designed with a specific moment in mind, the moment of ignition, the moment when controlled energy of enormous magnitude is directed downward to propel something upward. The infrastructure around a launch pad, the flame trench, the water deluge system, the support structures, the umbilical connections, is all organized around that single moment of purpose. In their abandoned state, all of this infrastructure sits waiting for a purpose that will never come. The launch pad is built for an event that it will never host again. That gap between design purpose and current reality is wider at Asera than anywhere else in the game, because what launch pads were designed to do was fundamentally optimistic, to send things away from the dying world below and towards something better. The presence of what appears to be emergency evacuation infrastructure at Asera is interesting and potentially revealing. Spaceports, particularly military-civilian mixed facilities of this kind, would typically have extensive emergency procedures and infrastructure for personnel evacuation in the event of launch accidents or other catastrophic events. But some of the evacuation infrastructure visible at Asera seems to have been used in a context that went beyond a standard emergency. Certain elements suggest a mass departure, not an emergency egress from a specific event, but a wholesale clearing of the facility. The question this raises is whether the evacuation of Asera was part of the broader civilian evacuation of the surrounding region, or whether it was something separate, a specific decision made about this facility by the people who ran it for reasons connected to what they were doing here. The communication infrastructure at Asera is extensive and interesting. Spaceports require constant high-bandwidth communication with the vehicles they launch, both during the launch process and during the subsequent orbital or transit phase. The antenna arrays, communication towers, and relay infrastructure visible at Asera are consistent with a facility that was maintaining contact with vehicles far above the atmosphere. Some of this infrastructure appears to have continued operating after the main facility was abandoned, based on the power evidence and the maintenance state of certain components. If that is the case, it raises a very specific question. What was Asera communicating with after everyone left? What was still up there at the other end of those communication links? The answer to that question is one that the environment of Asera strongly implies, but does not state. The game's broader lore context suggests that space-based infrastructure plays a role in the world of Arc Raiders that goes beyond simple communications and navigation. If Asera was maintaining contact with something orbital after its own abandonment, that contact was not routine operational communication. It was something more significant, either monitoring an existing space asset, communicating with a surviving crew or mission, or receiving data from something that had been sent up at some point before the facility went dark. The maintenance logs and operational documentation visible in Asera's control facilities are some of the most specific pieces of world building available in the location. These documents, where they can be read, describe operations that went well beyond conventional aerospace activity. The timeline implied by these records suggests an escalating pace of launch operations in the period preceding the facility's abandonment, a program that was accelerating rather than winding down as the situation on the ground deteriorated. This is counterintuitive. When infrastructure around you is collapsing, you do not generally accelerate your most ambitious and expensive programs, unless whatever you are launching is connected to the solution to the problem that is causing the collapse. The fuel storage infrastructure at Asera communicates the operational scale of the facility's launch program. Aerospace propellants of the type used for space launch operations are stored in vast quantities at launch facilities, and the storage infrastructure at Asera is consistent with a program that was launching vehicles regularly and frequently rather than occasionally. The fuel capacity visible in the storage areas implies a pace of operations that goes well beyond what would be needed for a few symbolic launches. This was a serious, sustained program of space launches conducted over an extended period of time. Whatever was being sent up, it was being sent up in quantity. The relationship between Asera and the military structures visible at the facility raises questions about what the launches were actually delivering. Space launch facilities with heavy military involvement are typically launching one of a few categories of payload: communications satellites, surveillance platforms, weapons systems, or personnel. In a period of crisis, with the world visibly deteriorating and arc raids increasing in frequency and intensity, The most likely interpretation of an accelerating launch program is that whoever was running Asera was trying to get either people or critical resources off the planet, or into orbit where they might be safer from Ark activity. The military involvement suggests this was not a civilian survival program. It was something more specifically planned, more deliberately organized, and probably more restricted in who it was for. The worker facilities at Asera, the accommodations, cafeteria spaces, and support infrastructure for the large workforce that a facility of this kind would require, are in a better state of preservation than might be expected, suggesting a more sudden departure than at the dam. Personal effects are present in significant numbers, particularly in dormitory-style housing, consistent with shift workers at a 24-hour operational facility. This is the signature of a departure that was ordered rather than gradually decided. People left when they were told to leave, and they left quickly, with limited time to collect their belongings. The workplace culture implied by the dormitory-style housing, people living at the facility, working around the clock in shifts, is consistent with a program operating under extreme time pressure. The damage patterns at Asera do not concentrate on the launch infrastructure. This is surprising and meaningful. If Ark activity were targeting the facility's capability, the launch pads and assembly halls would be the obvious priorities. Instead, the Ark damage at Asera is more dispersed, affecting peripheral structures and the outer reaches of the facility rather than the operational core. One reading of this pattern is that the core launch infrastructure was still operational when the facility was abandoned, that Asera was not forced to stop because Ark damage disabled the launch capability, but stopped for some other reason. Whether the launchers simply completed their program, or whether something else drove the facility's closure, is a question this damage pattern raises. The vast open spaces of the Asera apron areas, the flat concrete surfaces designed to support vehicle movement and ground operations, are one of the most visually distinctive features of the location. These spaces were never meant to be aesthetically interesting. They are purely functional surfaces. But in their abandoned state, they become something unexpected, a kind of blank canvas, a surface that communicates absence through its very featurelessness. The scale of the nothing at Asera is its own form of presence. You are aware, standing on those surfaces, that something should be here, that this much prepared space implies a use that is not currently being made of it. The engineering philosophy visible in Asera's construction is subtly different from the engineering philosophy of the other locations. At the dam, everything is about reliability and redundancy, systems built to keep working under adverse conditions. At the buried city, everything is about human comfort and social function. At Asera, the engineering is about performance, maximum capability, maximum precision, minimum tolerance for failure in the specific systems that matter for getting something into orbit. The engineering culture of a spaceport values different things from the engineering culture of a water treatment plant, and those different values are visible in the different qualities of the physical environment. The ground support vehicles visible at Asera, the large specialized equipment used to move, fuel, and prepare launch vehicles, are some of the most interesting artifacts in the location. These vehicles are unique to spaceport operations. You will not find them anywhere else, because they have no other use. They are the physical embodiment of the specific operational culture of a working launch facility, and their presence in an abandoned facility creates a strong sense of the facility's former life. These are tools that cannot be repurposed, skills that cannot be transferred, knowledge that cannot be applied anywhere else. When a spaceport goes dark, everything that was specific to it, the vehicles, the procedures, the expertise, goes with it. The presence of living quarters for long-term residents, rather than just shift workers at Asera, implies something about the nature of the facility's operations in its final phase. Some people who worked here were not commuting from the buried city or other nearby communities. They were living at the facility on a semi-permanent basis. This is consistent with a program that required continuity of personnel, that needed people who stayed with a project from beginning to end, rather than rotating in and out. Long-term on-site residence is typical of projects that involve classified work, specialized knowledge, or operational continuity that cannot be maintained with a rotating workforce. Whatever was being done at Asera, in its final phase, needed people who were there all the time. The spaceport's history suggests at least two distinct periods of operation: an earlier, more conventionally functional period, consistent with the standard operation of a major military civilian aerospace facility, and a later, more intense and secretive period, characterized by the accelerated launch program and the security enhancements visible in certain sections. The transition between these two periods is not cleanly dated, but the physical evidence suggests it corresponds roughly to the broader deterioration of conditions in the region. As things got worse on the ground, operations at Asera got more intense, more secured, and more secretive. The implication is that what was happening here was a response to the deteriorating situation, and the people responsible for that response were determined to complete it before conditions made it impossible. The orientation of the launch infrastructure at Asera, the specific directions in which the launch pads face, the angle of the flame trenches, the positioning of the primary communication arrays, provides information about where the vehicles launched from here were going. Launch trajectory is constrained by orbital mechanics in ways that are mathematically precise. The direction you launch determines the orbital inclination you can achieve without using additional fuel for plane changes. The launch infrastructure at Asera is oriented in a way that is consistent with launches targeted towards specific orbital regimes, and those regimes are not the low Earth commercial orbits that would serve communications or observation satellites. They are higher energy orbits, or possibly non-orbital trajectories, aimed at something further away than a simple satellite placement. The administrative sections of Asera contain evidence of a bureaucratic apparatus that was, in its final phase, operating under classification protocols significantly tighter than normal aerospace operations would require. The document handling procedures implied by the physical infrastructure, the communication security measures, the access control systems, all of this points toward a program that was being kept secret not just from outsiders, but from the majority of the people working at the facility. Compartmentalization of that kind, where each section of the workforce knows only its own piece of the operation, is a feature of programs that are sensitive enough, but even internal exposure is considered a security risk. Whatever was being launched from Asera, the full picture of the program was known to very few people. The arc energy signatures at Asera are qualitatively different from those at other locations. The specific characteristics of arc damage here suggest interaction with materials and geometries unique to aerospace applications. The exotic alloys used in launch vehicle construction, the specific geometries of propulsion systems, the electromagnetic properties of certain aerospace components. This gives the arc damage at Asera a distinctive appearance that you will not find elsewhere. The ruins here have a quality of having been touched by something that found the specific materials of aerospace construction uniquely interesting, which raises uncomfortable questions about whether arc activity has some form of attraction to high-technology targets. The relationship between Asera and the broader Arc Raiders narrative is one of the most significant in the game's world. If the spaceport represents an attempt to respond to the Arc situation through some form of space-based solution, then Asera is not just one of several locations in a post-apocalyptic world. It is the location where the most significant decision this world's civilization made in response to its crisis was actually executed. Whatever those launches delivered to orbit or beyond, that delivery changed the nature of the situation in ways that are still being felt. The current arc raids, the current state of the world, the current circumstances in which players operate, all of these may be downstream consequences of decisions made at Asera. The silence of the launch pads is one of the most effective elements of the Asera environment. A launch pad that has seen active use carries the history of that use in its physical structure: the ablative damage from exhaust plumes, the staining from propellants, the wear patterns from repeated installation of the same ground support equipment. These traces tell you that this pad was used, and used hard, and used many times. The silence that now occupies that space carries a specific weight because of those traces. You are standing in a place where something enormous happened, repeatedly, and the physical record of that history is written into the concrete. But the thing itself, the launch, the vehicle, the ambition, is gone. The environmental exposure at Asera is different from the other locations. The open concrete surfaces, the lack of natural windbreaks, the scale of the open spaces, all of these make Asera an exposed place in a way that the other locations are not. The wind moves through it differently. The weather affects it differently. The exposure to the sky, which was operationally necessary for a spaceport, now means exposure to arc activity without the shelter of dense urban structures or mountain topography. Asera is naked to the sky in a way that the other locations are not, and the sky in this world is not safe. The human cost of operating Asera in its final phase is implied by the evidence of overwork visible in the worker facilities. The consumption patterns, the improvised modifications to work areas suggesting people doing multiple roles, the evidence of extended continuous shifts, all of this speaks to a workforce being pushed to its limits. A launch program that accelerated as the world deteriorated did so at a human cost that the environmental evidence makes real. People were working themselves to exhaustion here, trying to complete something before it became impossible to complete. The urgency is palpable in the physical remains of their working lives. The technical complexity of the assembly halls at Asera points toward launch vehicles of a sophistication that goes beyond what would be needed for simple orbital insertions. The equipment visible in these spaces, the tooling, the handling systems, the precision assembly fixtures, is consistent with vehicles built to precise specifications and assembled to exacting tolerances. This is the equipment of a serious, well-funded aerospace engineering program working at the frontier of what the technology of the era could accomplish. The launches from Asera were not improvised responses to a crisis. They were the culmination of a long-term program that had been in development well before the crisis reached its current severity. The positioning of Asera within the landscape of the game's world, its relationship to the other locations, its accessibility from the buried city, its connections to the transportation infrastructure that once linked the region, suggests that this was not an isolated facility. It was integrated into the broader economy and infrastructure of the region. Workers came from the buried city. Supplies came through the same distribution networks that served the dam. The spaceport was part of the world, not separate from it. Its current isolation is a product of the world's collapse, not of any inherent separateness. Asera was always connected. It is only in its abandonment that it has become an island. The question of whether anyone is still monitoring what Asera launched is one that the facility's communication infrastructure raises directly. The antenna systems here were not entirely passive. They were designed to receive as well as transmit, and the directionality of certain arrays suggests they were pointed at specific points in the sky. If those systems ever come back to life, if the power that still flickers in certain sections of the facility were ever to be reliably restored, those arrays might still be able to reach whatever is at the other end of the link they were designed to maintain. Whether anyone in the current world of Arc Raiders would want that link re-established, and whether what is on the other end of it would respond, are questions that the environment of Asera raises and leaves hanging. Asera's ultimate significance in the Arc Raiders world is as evidence of the last great collective effort this civilization made before collapsing. Not a war, not a response to a natural disaster, but a space program. An effort that was ambitious, secretive, and apparently still ongoing when the facility finally went quiet. The human capacity for ambition in the face of catastrophe, the willingness to keep reaching upward even as the ground beneath you gives way. That is what Asera represents. It is the monument to a civilization's last determined act, conducted in the shadow of its own collapse, pointed toward a sky that was actively trying to kill it. The ruins of Asera speak most clearly when you understand them as the ruins of hope, not the hope of survival. Survival is what the dam was trying to ensure, what the buried city was organized around, what the mountain facilities were working toward. What Asera represents is something beyond survival. It represents the hope of escaping the problem entirely, of finding a way out that the problem itself could not follow. Whether that hope was realized, whether what was launched from these pads found what it was looking for, whether there is anything up there that represents the success of whatever was attempted here. These are the questions that the silence of Asera's launch pads cannot answer. They just sit there, scarred and empty, pointed at a sky that gives nothing back. Chapter 4. The Blue Gate, the mountain that has always been watching. The Blue Gate is the most unusual map in Arc Raiders, and it is unusual in ways that reward attention. The other locations in this game have identities that are easily described: industrial facility, urban ruin, spaceport, research station. The Blue Gate resists easy description because it is more than one thing at once. It is a natural landscape of genuine beauty, an ancient fortification complex of mysterious origin, and a modern military installation built directly into and on top of the older structures. The layering of these three things, the natural, the ancient, and the modern, in a single location creates an environment that feels simultaneously timeless and deeply specific, and the combination raises questions that the individual layers cannot answer on their own. The first layer to examine is the natural one. The Blue Gate sits at high altitude, in mountain terrain that would be challenging to traverse, even without the environmental hazards the Ark Raiders world presents. The rock formations here have a quality that is distinct from the manufactured environments of the other maps. They were not placed here by human decision. They were not shaped by industrial or civic intent. They are simply what the mountain is. But even within the natural layer, there are things worth examining. The specific topography of the Blue Gate area, the passes, the plateaus, the cliff faces, suggest that this location was chosen for its natural defensive qualities. The mountain does not need to be fortified. Its natural configuration already makes it difficult to approach from most directions. The ancient fortifications at the Blue Gate are one of the most striking features of the location. These are not modern structures. They are old, built from the same stone as the mountain itself, integrated into the terrain in a way that suggests either extraordinary skill or extraordinary time. The construction techniques visible in the older sections of the Blue Gate fortifications are not consistent with industrial-era construction methods. They predate the kind of machinery that would normally be used to move and shape stone at this scale in this location. Someone built these fortifications by hand or with pre-industrial tools over what must have been a very long period of time at a site that was already extremely difficult to access. The question of who built the ancient fortifications at the Blue Gate is one the game does not directly answer, and that ambiguity is part of what gives the location its particular atmosphere. In the real world, high-altitude mountain fortifications of this scale and sophistication are typically associated with significant historical civilizations, with empires that had both the resources and the reason to invest in permanent defensive infrastructure at extreme altitude. The Blue Gate's fortifications suggest a civilization that considered this specific mountain pass strategically significant enough to justify an enormous long-term investment in its fortification. That civilization, whatever it was, is not the civilization of Ark Raiders. It came before. The implications of that antiquity are part of what makes the Blue Gate feel different from everywhere else in the game. The integration of modern defensive technology with the ancient stone fortifications is the architectural signature of the Blue Gate. Wherever you look in this location, the ancient and the modern are in conversation with each other, sometimes literally, with modern weapons emplacements or sensor systems mounted on ancient stone walls, or with modern access tunnels cut through sections of ancient fortification structure. The decision to build on top of the existing fortifications, rather than replacing them, says something about the judgment of whoever made that decision. The ancient structures were good enough, sturdy enough, and positioned correctly enough to be worth incorporating rather than removing. Someone looked at these 1,000-year-old walls and decided they were still doing a useful job. The cavern systems at the Blue Gate are where the location becomes truly unusual. High-altitude mountain locations do not typically feature extensive natural cave systems. The geology of mountains tends to produce fractures and faces rather than the dissolved limestone structures that produce cave systems at lower altitudes. The caverns at the Blue Gate are therefore geologically interesting, and their existence suggests specific things about the local geology that are not typical of the mountain environment visible above ground. Either the local bedrock has specific solubility characteristics that produce natural cave formation, or some of these caverns are not entirely natural. The puzzle-like quality of the deeper cavern sections points toward the latter interpretation, or at least suggests that the natural caverns have been significantly modified. The defensive value of the Blue Gate location becomes clearer the more you understand its geography. A high-altitude mountain pass is a strategic choke point, an area where movement from one side of a mountain range to another must necessarily pass through a limited space. Whoever controls the pass controls movement through the mountain range. The Blue Gate's name itself implies this function. A gate is an access control mechanism, and the Blue Gate is positioned to control access through the mountains in which it sits. Whether the blue in the name refers to something visual about the location, something symbolic about its protective function, or something else entirely is not clear, but the gate part is unambiguous. This is a place where something can be let through or kept out. The military installations built into the Blue Gate represent a significant investment of resources and engineering effort. Constructing military facilities at high altitude, in terrain that complicates supply chains and limits the size of the workforce that can be deployed, is expensive and difficult. The decision to do so implies a specific threat assessment, a belief that this location needed to be defended, that the natural defensive value of the mountain was not sufficient on its own, and that modern military technology would be necessary to augment what the ancient fortifications already provided. The nature of the threat that prompted this investment is not explicitly identified by the environment, but the configuration of the defenses, particularly the way they are oriented, provides some clues. The sky-facing defensive systems at the Blue Gate are one of its most distinctive features. Most of the defensive infrastructure you would expect at a location like this would be oriented toward the ground-level approaches, the mountain paths, the valley floors, the other passes in the area, and those orientations exist at the Blue Gate. But there are also systems here that appear to be designed to engage threats coming from above. Anti-arc defenses, perhaps, or weapons systems designed to interact with something coming from the air or from space. The presence of these sky-facing systems at a location that is already extremely difficult to approach from the ground suggests that whoever fortified the Blue Gate was worried about more than conventional ground-level threats. The mystical quality attributed to the Blue Gate by the game's wider lore context is interesting, because it is not mystical in any supernatural sense. It is mystical in the sense that its history is opaque, its original purpose is unclear, its builders are unknown, and its current significance is wrapped in secrecy. These are the conditions under which locations acquire reputations for mystery. Not because anything supernatural has happened there, but because the human need to explain the unexplained generates stories to fill the gaps that documented history leaves empty. The Blue Gate has been generating those stories for probably as long as people have known about it, and the current military occupation has added new layers of secrecy rather than resolving the old ones. The supplies and equipment cached at the Blue Gate are consistent with a facility designed for long-term independent operation. The stores visible in certain sections of the location represent more than would be needed for a short-term defensive deployment. Someone stocked this location as if they expected it to need to operate self-sufficiently for an extended period, possibly indefinitely. This is a meaningful choice that speaks to the strategic conception behind the Blue Gate's military upgrade. This was not a temporary installation. It was designed to last, designed to be viable without external resupply, and designed with the assumption that whoever was here might need to hold on for a very long time without help coming from outside. The communication systems at the Blue Gate are unusual in their orientation and configuration. High-altitude locations are often used for communications infrastructure because the elevation provides line of sight to distant points that would be blocked from lower ground. The Blue Gate's communication systems reflect this, with arrays pointed in directions consistent with maintaining contact with other high-altitude installations, specifically with other locations in the mountain chain of which the Blue Gate is a part. This suggests a network of mountain facilities connected by high-altitude communications, of which the Blue Gate is one node. Stella montis, which we will get to in the next chapter, is almost certainly another node in this same network. The deeper cavern sections of the Blue Gate are where the location's puzzle-like qualities become most apparent. Natural caverns do not typically contain the kinds of features visible in the deeper sections here. Elements that appear to serve specific functions, passageways that seem designed rather than formed, areas that suggest deliberate modification over a long period of time. The interpretation this points toward is that the caverns at the Blue Gate have been used and modified by human activity spanning multiple historical periods. The oldest modifications are barely distinguishable from the natural cave formations. The more recent ones are clearly human-made. Between them, there is a layered record of occupation and use that spans potentially centuries. The specific configuration of the ancient fortifications at the Blue Gate reveals something about the tactical doctrine of whoever built them. These are not walls built simply to exclude. They are walls built to channel to funnel anyone trying to pass through into specific routes where they would be exposed to defenders in specific positions. This is sophisticated military architecture, reflecting a detailed understanding of how an attacker would approach and how a defender could best use the terrain. The builders of the original Blue Gate fortifications were not simply piling rocks, they were executing a defensive plan that showed knowledge of siege warfare, archery, and the use of terrain as a force multiplier. The modern military additions to the Blue Gate show a similar tactical sophistication, operating through completely different technologies. The sensor systems, the weapons emplacements, the communication infrastructure, all of these reflect a defensive doctrine that is conceptually consistent with the ancient fortifications, even though it operates through fundamentally different means. There is a continuity of tactical thinking here that spans centuries, applied to the same terrain by people who may have had no knowledge of each other, but who arrived at similar conclusions about how to defend this specific location. The mountain teaches the same lessons to every generation that comes to defend it. The cultural significance of the Blue Gate is implied by the effort that has been directed at it over time. Places that receive this level of sustained investment, fortified, used, upgraded, abandoned, refortified across multiple historical periods, are places that have been recognized as significant by many different groups over many different eras. That sustained recognition implies that whatever makes the Blue Gate valuable is something that does not change over time. Strategic location persists. A mountain pass that controlled movement 1,000 years ago controls movement today. The value is in the geography, and geography does not change on human timescales. The spiritual or ceremonial elements that the location's visual design implies are worth taking seriously, even if they are not explicitly confirmed by the game's lore. The integration of the fortifications with the natural landscape, the presence of features that look like they may have served ritual or ceremonial functions in addition to purely defensive ones. The overall sense that this place was considered significant in ways that went beyond the strategic, all of these point toward a cultural investment in the Blue Gate that is not purely military. People who built here over centuries did not just see a defensive asset. Some of them, at least, saw something more. The Ark activity over the Blue Gate has a different character from the Ark activity at other locations. At the Buried City and at Asera, Ark raids appear to target or impact specific kinds of infrastructure. At the Blue Gate, the Ark activity seems less targeted, or perhaps more accurately, the Ark activity seems to be responding to something about this location that is not infrastructure in the conventional sense. The mountain itself appears to interact with Ark energy in ways that are unusual, deflecting or concentrating Ark forces in patterns that do not seem to be the result of the constructed features of the site. This points towards something about the mountain's natural properties, its geology, its elevation, its specific electromagnetic characteristics, that may be relevant to the Ark phenomenon in ways that are not yet fully understood. The tunnel systems cut through the mountain at the Blue Gate represent an enormous engineering achievement, regardless of the era in which they were constructed. Tunneling through mountain rock at altitude for significant distances requires sustained effort, appropriate tools, and a compelling reason to make the investment. The older tunnels visible at the Blue Gate were not cut by modern equipment, yet they are extensive enough and precise enough to suggest a serious long-term engineering effort by their original builders. The fact that later occupiers of this location found these tunnels useful enough to incorporate into their own operational plans rather than closing them off speaks to the quality of the original work. The view from the high points of the Blue Gate deserves its own consideration. Standing at the elevated positions within this location, you can see enormous distances in multiple directions. On a clear day, the sight lines would extend to the horizon in every direction that is not blocked by higher mountain terrain. This visibility is both a tactical asset and a sensory experience. You can see things coming from a very long way away, and you can see a very large extent of the world that surrounds this mountain. In the context of Ark Raider's world, that visibility extends to Ark activity, which would be visible from altitude in ways that would provide genuine warning time. The Blue Gate is, among other things, an observation post for the end of the world. The current state of the Blue Gate's modern military installations suggests an abandonment that was more ordered than the abandonment of most Ark Raiders locations. The defensive systems, while non-operational, appear to have been deliberately deactivated rather than simply failing due to neglect. The equipment in certain sections shows signs of having been methodically secured before departure. Systems placed in protected configurations, sensitive components removed or destroyed, access to critical areas sealed. Someone left the Blue Gate in a way that suggests they expected the possibility that someone else might eventually try to use it, and they made deliberate choices about what that future occupier would be able to access and what they would not. The relationship between the Blue Gate and the Stella Montis facility is one of the most interesting connections to explore in the Ark Raiders world. Both locations are high altitude, both have military dimensions, and both show signs of having been part of the same coordinated system of mountain-based operations. The communication links between them, the similarity of certain infrastructure elements, the consistency of the security protocols implied by the physical evidence, all of these suggest that these two locations were not independent operations, but components of a single strategic plan operating across the mountain chain. What that plan was, and what it was intended to accomplish, is one of the central questions the mountain locations raise. The defensive orientation of the Blue Gate, with its sky-facing components and its unusual interaction with arc energy, points toward a specific theory about its final military use. The Blue Gate may not have been primarily a conventional military installation in its final configuration. It may have been something closer to an arc defense installation, a facility designed to study, predict, or counter arc raid activity. The high altitude would have been valuable for this purpose, providing both advance warning of incoming arc activity and potentially a better position from which to deploy any countermeasures that the technology of the era could provide. The mystical reputation of the Blue Gate may derive, at least in part, from activities connected to arc response that were conducted here under conditions of high secrecy. The personnel records implied by the living quarters at the Blue Gate suggest a small but technically sophisticated workforce. The facilities visible in the habitation sections are not designed for large numbers. This was not a big garrison. It was a small team of specialists working in a highly specific field, in a location chosen for its combination of natural defensive value, strategic position, and possibly some quality specific to arc research. The small size of the team is consistent with a compartmentalized program, one that was deliberately kept small to limit the number of people who knew what was happening here. The architecture of the Blue Gate taken as a whole, the ancient stonework, the mountain terrain, the carved caverns, the modern military additions, creates an environment that communicates a very specific thing. This is a place that has mattered to many people across a very long span of time. Each group that came here found it valuable and invested in it accordingly. The cumulative investment is visible in the physical environment as a layered record of sustained human attention, and the fact that the most recent layer of that attention, the modern military occupation, has now ended does not diminish what came before. The Blue Gate will continue to be what the mountain has always made it, a strategic and significant place, regardless of whether anyone is currently in a position to exploit that significance. The deepest cavern sections of the Blue Gate contain evidence of activities that do not fit neatly into either the ancient or the modern narrative of the location. There are things here, modifications to natural formations, installations of equipment in locations that would be extremely difficult to access, traces of activities that are not consistent with either a defensive garrison or a conventional research program, that point toward a third purpose for this location, one that may overlap with both the ancient and the modern histories without being fully explained by either. Whatever was done in the deepest parts of the Blue Gate, it was done by people who went to extraordinary lengths to ensure that it could not easily be discovered, documented, or undone. The enduring mystery of the Blue Gate is not simply a product of incomplete information. It is a product of deliberate obfuscation across multiple historical periods, by multiple groups that each had reasons to keep what they were doing here secret. The ancient builders kept their purposes opaque through the simple mechanism of not leaving easily legible records. The modern military operators kept their purposes opaque through classification and compartmentalization. Between these two layers of intentional secrecy, the true story of the Blue Gate, what it was actually for, what was actually accomplished here, and what, if anything, remains active in its deepest sections, is one of the most genuinely unresolved questions in the Ark Raiders world. The mountain keeps its secrets, and the evidence left by those who tried to use it for their own purposes does not in the end add up to a complete answer. It adds up to better questions. Chapter 5, Stella Montis, the cold science at the end of the world. Stella Montis is the last location, and in some ways it is the most important one to understand, because it provides the clearest window into the kind of thinking that the civilization of Ark Raiders' world was doing in response to its crisis. The other locations show you the crisis, the infrastructure failing, the cities dying, the desperate launches from the spaceport, the fortified mountain positions. Stella Montis shows you the attempt to understand the crisis from a scientific perspective, and the specific kind of understanding being pursued here tells you a great deal about what this world's best minds thought was actually going on, and what, if anything, could be done about it. The physical environment of Stella Montis communicates the facility's purpose immediately and unambiguously. This is a research facility, not a weapons facility, not a military base, not a production center. A research facility with the specific architecture of scientific investigation. The multi-level laboratory sections, the specialized equipment storage, the sample handling areas, the data processing infrastructure, all of these are the architecture of science, of systematic inquiry, of the accumulation and analysis of empirical data. Someone was doing careful, methodical work here, and they were doing it in conditions that required both physical isolation and significant technological support. The choice to locate this research facility in the northern mountains at high altitude, carved directly into the rock, suggests a set of requirements that went beyond what a conventional, below-ground facility could provide. High altitude provides specific advantages for certain kinds of research: atmospheric studies, electromagnetic observations, isolation from radio frequency interference, reduced background radiation from cosmic ray secondaries. Any or all of these factors might have contributed to the decision to build here rather than somewhere more accessible. But there are also advantages specific to the Ark Raiders' context. High altitude provides advance warning of Ark activity, and the mountain provides natural shielding that might be valuable for experiments that required isolation from external electromagnetic phenomena. The sterile, cold atmosphere that characterizes Stella Montis is one of its defining features. This is not the warmth of a human habitation space or the industrial grime of the dam. It is the deliberate, maintained sterility of a scientific environment. An environment where contamination control matters, where the physical conditions of the space are regulated rather than simply accepted. Even in its abandoned state, that sterility persists in a particular way. The surfaces that were designed to be clean remain cleaner than they should be given the time elapsed since abandonment. The environmental control systems that once maintained specific temperature and humidity conditions have failed, but they have failed in a way that has left a cold, dry residue rather than the biological growth you would see in a warmer, wetter, abandoned space. The multi-level underground laboratory layout of Stella Montis communicates a specific research philosophy. Research programs that require multi-level underground facilities typically do so because they are working with phenomena that require either depth of shielding, vertical separation for different experimental stages, or the specific properties of deep rock, vibration isolation, electromagnetic shielding, thermal stability. The underground configuration of Stella Montis is therefore not simply a response to the difficulty of building on a mountain's surface. It is a positive choice reflecting specific requirements of the research being conducted. The fact that the facility goes down rather than up tells you something about what the science needed that the sky could not provide. The loading bays at Stella Montis are one of the most interesting architectural features of the facility. Loading bays at a high-altitude mountain research station represent a significant logistical challenge. Everything that enters or leaves this facility must be transported up the mountain, which at this altitude means specialized vehicles, specific routes, and significant operational cost. The scale of the loading infrastructure here implies that the facility was receiving and dispatching material in quantities substantial enough to justify that cost on a regular basis. Either large quantities of equipment were being brought in for the research program, or large quantities of material were being taken out. Data, samples, products of the research, or both. The nature of the scientific equipment visible at Stella Montis is one of the most important clues about what was being studied here. The instrumentation is not general purpose. It is specifically configured for measurements and experiments that relate to energy phenomena, electromagnetic fields, particle detection, spectral analysis, temporal measurement, all of the instrumentation you would associate with a facility trying to characterize and understand a large-scale energy phenomenon of unknown physics. In the context of the arc raiders world, the obvious candidate for the phenomenon being studied is the arc raids themselves. Stella Montis looks very much like a facility built specifically to understand what arc actually is. The research data visible in the facility, in the few places where data storage has survived in legible form, does not provide definitive conclusions, but it does point toward a specific direction of inquiry. The measurements being made here were tracking patterns, temporal patterns in arc activity, spatial distribution of arc effects, correlations between arc activity and specific ground conditions or atmospheric states. The research program was not reactive. It was predictive in its ambitions, trying to identify regularities in arc behavior that might make future arc activity predictable. A world in which arc raids could be predicted with useful advance warning would be a very different world from the one we see in arc raiders. The research at Stella Montis was in this reading an attempt to build the predictive capability that might have made such a world possible. The specific design of the laboratory sections at Stella Montis reflects a concern with measurement integrity. The shielding of experimental areas, the isolation of sensitive equipment from vibration and electromagnetic interference, the protocols for handling samples without contaminating them with external material, all of these speak to a research culture that was serious about the quality of its data. Whatever conclusions were being drawn from the work done here, they were being drawn from carefully gathered, rigorously controlled measurements. This was not rushed or improvised science. It was methodical work conducted to high standards. The personnel facilities at Stella Montis tell a story about the workforce that lived and worked here. This was not a large group. The living quarters are compact and functional rather than spacious or comfortable, and they were clearly designed for people who accepted a Spartan existence as the price of being able to do the work. The research culture implied by these facilities is one of intense commitment. People who chose to be in this location, at this altitude, in this isolation, because the work demanded it. The intellectual and professional culture of the facility would have been characterized by exactly the kind of focus and dedication that the physical environment rewarded and the alternative locations discouraged. The connection between Stella Montis and the Blue Gate, implied by the communication infrastructure and the consistency of certain operational protocols, raises questions about how these two mountain facilities related to each other functionally. One possible reading is that they served complementary purposes. Stella Montis doing the science, the Blue Gate providing the defensive and logistical infrastructure to protect it. A research facility doing sensitive work on the most threatening phenomenon facing human civilization would require protection, and the Blue Gate's defensive capabilities and strategic position would have made it an appropriate guardian for the research operations of Stella Montis. The two facilities, in this interpretation, are two parts of a single system. The material science evident in the construction of Stella Montis is sophisticated. The facility was built to withstand the specific challenges of high-altitude mountain construction. Temperature extremes, seismic activity, freeze-thaw cycling in the rock around the excavated spaces. The engineering solutions visible in the facility's structure reflect a detailed understanding of these challenges and a willingness to invest in the appropriate solutions. This is not a facility that was built cheaply or quickly. It was built by people who expected it to last a very long time and invested accordingly. The current state of the facility, even in abandonment, reflects that quality of construction. It is deteriorating, but more slowly and more gracefully than a less well-built facility would. The cold of Stella Montis is not just environmental. It is embedded in the design philosophy of the place. Cold and sterile environments are chosen for research because they minimize uncontrolled variables. They are chosen for server rooms and data storage because cold preserves information-bearing media. They are chosen for certain kinds of sample storage because cold slows the biological and chemical processes that would otherwise degrade samples. The consistent coldness of Stella montis serves all of these purposes simultaneously, and the design choices that maintain that coldness even in the facility's abandoned state suggest that whoever built it wanted it to stay cold even if the active climate control systems failed. The cold is built into the architecture itself. The data storage infrastructure at Stella montis is one of its most significant features from a narrative standpoint. Research generates data, and data needs to be stored, protected, and accessible. The data storage systems here are extensive, redundant, and clearly designed to outlast the active life of the research program. Someone at Stella montis designed the data archive with the explicit intention that it should survive the facility's operational period and remain accessible afterward. This is not the behavior of an organization that expects to transfer its findings through conventional academic or institutional channels. It is the behavior of an organization that expects its findings to need to be recovered by whoever comes next, in conditions that might be far from ideal. The specific sections of the facility dedicated to arc sample analysis are among the most interesting parts of Stella montis. If arc raids leave behind any material that can be collected and analyzed, then the analysis of that material will be one of the most important scientific tasks of this world. The instruments configured for material analysis in the laboratory sections of Stella montis are consistent with exactly this kind of work: detecting, isolating, and characterizing novel materials or energy signatures associated with arc activity. Whatever the arc raids actually are, whatever physical process underlies the destruction they cause, understanding that process would begin with characterizing the material signatures they leave behind. The safety protocols visible at Stella montis tell their own story. Research facilities that handle hazardous materials have specific safety infrastructure, and the safety infrastructure at Stella montis is extensive and specifically configured for hazards that go beyond the conventional. The containment systems, the decontamination procedures implied by the layout of certain sections, the emergency response infrastructure, all of these are calibrated for something that is not an ordinary industrial chemical or biological agent. The hazard that prompted this level of safety design is consistent with materials of unknown properties. Materials whose risks are not fully characterized and may be substantially greater than initially apparent. In the context of arc-related research, that description fits precisely. The administrative section of Stella montis contains evidence of a decision-making process regarding the facility's final disposition. The documentation in these sections, where it is readable, reflects discussions about what to do with the research, how to protect it, how to preserve access to it for future use, and how to ensure that the knowledge accumulated here did not die with the facility. There are records of debates about whether to transmit the data, destroy it, bury it, or attempt to physically remove it. The final decision implied by the physical evidence appears to have been to leave it in place, secured with whatever measures could be taken to ensure its survival. The facility was not evacuated the way a conventional workplace is evacuated. Its contents were deliberately and carefully configured for long-term preservation before the last person left. The timeline of Stella montis's final operational period, implied by the physical evidence, suggests a gradual wind-down rather than a sudden closure. The research program appears to have concluded before the evacuation. The labs were secured in ways consistent with the conclusion of an experimental series rather than an emergency shutdown. This is significant because it implies that the research reached some kind of endpoint, not necessarily a successful one, not necessarily a conclusion with clear answers, but an endpoint nevertheless. Whatever Stella montis was trying to find out, the facility's final period was characterized by a decision that enough had been found, or that no more could be found, and that it was time to secure the results and leave. The laboratory notes visible in certain sections of Stella montis, where they survive in legible form, are fragmentary but coherent enough to give a sense of the scientific methodology in use here. The approach was empirical rather than theoretical. The researchers at Stella montis were not starting from first principles and building a theoretical framework for arc phenomena. They were starting from observations and measurements, trying to identify patterns and regularities in the data that might eventually support a theoretical understanding. This is the approach of a mature scientific program operating under time pressure. Take what measurements you can, identify what patterns you can, leave the theoretical interpretation for later or for someone else. The relationship between the research at Stella Montis and the launches from Asera spaceport is one of the most suggestive connections in the entire Ark Raiders world. If the spaceport was launching things into orbit or beyond in response to the Ark situation, the scientific research at Stella Montis would be the most likely source of the scientific justification for whatever was being launched. The two facilities in this reading are connected by a causal chain. The science at Stella Montis informed the decisions made at Asera, and what was launched from Asera was the practical response to what the science at Stella Montis had found. Whether that response worked, whether the space program that Asera executed achieved its purpose, is a question the research notes at Stella Montis may partially answer in the form of projections and models that predicted what the orbital program might accomplish. The cold silence of Stella Montis in its abandoned state is perhaps the most affecting quality of the location. There is something particular about a scientific facility gone quiet. Science is an inherently active process. It requires people asking questions, running experiments, analyzing data, arguing about to take more measurements when the results are ambiguous. All of that activity, all of that questioning and measuring and arguing produced the environment visible at Stella Montis. The equipment is arranged for experiments. The notes are mid-thought. The data storage is full of numbers that someone spent enormous effort collecting. And all of it sits in silence, awaiting someone who knows how to read it. The presence of certain equipment configurations at Stella Montis that appear to be oriented toward temporal rather than purely spatial measurement is one of the more unusual aspects of the facility. Instruments designed to measure time-varying phenomena, to track how something changes over time, to identify periodicities and cycles in a dataset, are present here in significant numbers. The research at Stella Montis was not just mapping where Ark activity occurred. It was trying to understand when Ark activity occurred, and specifically whether there was a regular pattern to Ark behavior that could be characterized as a cycle. If Ark activity follows a cycle, then the most important scientific question in this world is how long that cycle is, and where in the cycle the world currently sits. The structural deepening of the facility as you move to its lower levels is associated with a change in the character of the research evidence. The upper levels show the signatures of data collection and analysis, measurement equipment, analytical instruments, data storage. The lower levels show something different, evidence of more experimental activities, more hands-on research, more direct engagement with materials and samples. The deeper you go in Stella Montis, the closer you get to whatever the facility was most directly investigating. The lower levels are where the most protected, most sensitive, and most significant work was done, and the care taken to secure those levels before the final departure suggests that what was found there was considered extremely important. The decontamination chambers at specific points in the facility's lower levels are a notable architectural feature. Moving between the upper and lower sections of Stella Montis required passing through decontamination, which implies that the lower sections contained materials or active processes that could contaminate the upper sections if transferred. In the context of a research facility studying Ark phenomena, this containment logic makes a specific kind of sense. If Ark-related materials were being handled in the lower sections, ensuring that those materials did not migrate to the rest of the facility would be a basic safety requirement. The decontamination chambers are therefore evidence that Ark-associated materials were being handled directly in the facility's most secure sections. The emergency override systems at Stella Montis are designed to isolate and seal the lower facility sections in the event of a containment failure. The existence of these systems implies that a containment failure was considered a realistic possibility by the facility's designers. Something in the lower sections of Stella Montis could, if containment was lost, pose a threat significant enough to justify the complete isolation of those sections from the rest of the facility. The design of these override systems, their positioning, their activation logic, their fail-safe configurations, tells you something about the nature of the threat they were designed to address. This is not the design you would build for a conventional chemical hazard. It is the design you would build for something with a different mode of action, something that could propagate in ways that conventional containment is not well designed to stop. The final entries in the administrative record at Stella Montis, where they are legible, do not describe a crisis. they describe a conclusion. The tone is methodical, not panicked. The decisions recorded are operational decisions about securing the facility, not emergency decisions about saving lives. This is consistent with a planned closure, an orderly end to an operation that had run its course, not a desperate flight from an advancing threat. Whatever happened in the final days of Stella Montis was apparently not a surprise to the people who were there. They had time to do what needed to be done, in the order they thought it should be done, and then they left. The research legacy of Stella Montis is its most significant aspect. The physical facility is remarkable. The engineering achievement of carving a sophisticated research installation into a high-altitude mountain. The quality of the construction, the range of the scientific instruments. But these are all in service of what was accumulated here, intellectually, in the form of data, analysis, models, and conclusions about the most important scientific question of this world's era. Whether anyone in the current Ark Raiders world knows what Stella Montis contains, whether anyone is trying to access and interpret its archives, and whether the conclusions reached here are part of what is driving the behavior of the game's factions. All of these are questions the facility raises without answering. The interaction between Stella Montis and the Ark phenomenon itself is something the facility's design does not entirely manage to escape. Despite the shielding, despite the depth of the rock above the laboratory sections, despite all of the engineering directed at isolating the facility from external electromagnetic influences, there are sections of Stella Montis where arc energy appears to have penetrated. The signatures are subtle compared to what you see at more exposed locations, but they are present. This suggests that whatever arc is at its fundamental level, it is not simply electromagnetic radiation that can be blocked by rock. It is something that interacts with matter in ways that rock alone cannot stop. The research program at Stella Montis would have been confronting this fact directly, and the implications of it for the facility's fundamental design assumptions would have been significant. The abandonment of Stella Montis did not end the research program. It merely relocated it, in the sense that the data and conclusions gathered here were configured for future recovery and use. Whoever comes after, whoever eventually enters this facility with the capability and motivation to access its archives, will find a record of the most serious and sustained scientific effort this world made to understand what was happening to it. The cold rooms and empty corridors of Stella Montis are not a tomb for that effort. They are a library. The books have not been burned. They are waiting for a reader who knows how to find them and what to do with them. Whether that reader has yet arrived, and whether the knowledge preserved in these rooms has changed anything about the situation that made its collection necessary, is a question that the 5 locations covered in this video together raise, but cannot alone answer. The maps of Ark Raiders, taken together, tell a story about a civilization that understood what was happening to it well enough to mount several different kinds of response simultaneously. The dam tried to maintain the essential infrastructure of life. The buried city concentrated the population of a region in a space that was organized for collective survival. Asera attempted to find a solution in space, launching something into orbit that might address the problem from outside the atmosphere. The Blue Gate defended the knowledge and personnel of the response effort, and Stella Montis generated the scientific understanding that informed everything else. These 5 locations are not random ruins in a post-apocalyptic landscape. They are 5 components of a coordinated, deliberate, and desperately serious response to an existential threat. The question that remains is whether it was enough. The 5 locations, when you map them against each other geographically and chronologically, begin to suggest something about the shape of the world's collapse that no single location can communicate on its own. The dam was the earliest casualty of the infrastructure breakdown, losing its operational capacity through the slow attrition of maintenance decline and institutional failure. The buried city followed, or possibly collapsed in parallel, as the loss of clean water supply compounded whatever other pressures the urban population was already under. Asera continued operating into the crisis and possibly beyond it, sustained by whatever program it was executing. The Blue Gate and Stella Montis, both mountain-based, both characterized by ordered rather than chaotic abandonment, appear to have been the last elements of the organized response, the pieces that were maintained longest, closed most deliberately, and left with the most obvious intention of future recovery. The timeline this suggests is not a single catastrophic event followed by rapid collapse. It is a drawn-out process, measured in years or possibly decades, in which the civilization of Ark Raider's world fought a deteriorating situation with every tool available to it. The Ark raids were real and damaging, but the broader collapse was not simply caused by the raids. It was caused by the interaction of the raids with systems that were already under pressure: environmental, institutional, economic, social. The raids broke things that were already weakened. They accelerated declines that were already underway. They made irreparable what might otherwise have been repairable, and they did so at precisely the moments when the capacity to make repairs was most compromised. Understanding this interaction between the Ark phenomenon and the broader systemic vulnerabilities of this world's civilization is what makes the 5 maps worth studying as a set rather than as individual locations. Each map shows you one piece of the failure, one dimension of the collapse, one component of both the problem and the response. But the collapse was not compartmentalized in the way that the maps are. The water supply failure at the dam affected the population of the buried city. The population movement from the buried city affected the operational capacity of every facility in the region. The research at Stella Montis may have informed the launches from Asera. The defensive operations at the Blue Gate may have protected personnel working across multiple other sites. Everything was connected, and understanding the connections is understanding the story. The factions currently operating within these locations, the players themselves and whatever other groups contest the space, are therefore not operating in empty ruins. They are operating in the physical residue of an interconnected system that once functioned, however imperfectly, as an integrated response to an existential problem. The scavenging, the conflict, the extraction of materials and information from these locations is happening in spaces that still contain the evidence of that system, not just as background atmosphere, but as potentially actionable intelligence. The data at Stella Montis, the communication systems at the Blue Gate, the launch records at Asera, the operational documentation at the dam, the buried archives of the buried city. All of this is still there, waiting. The question of whether any faction in the current Ark Raiders world has the awareness and the capability to put these pieces together, to read the 5 locations as a coherent set, to extract the relevant information from each, and to use that information to understand what was done and whether it can be continued, is one of the most interesting questions the game's world raises. It is also, potentially, one of the most important. If the space program at Asera succeeded in placing something in orbit that can address Ark activity, and if the research at Stella Montis contains the data needed to activate or direct that orbital asset, then the 5 maps are not just ruins. They are the operating manual for a tool that may still be available, waiting for someone who knows what it is and how to use it. The Ark raids have not stopped. Whatever is happening in the sky above these 5 locations, whatever the Ark phenomenon is at its fundamental level, it is still occurring. The world that produced these locations, the civilization that built the dam and the buried city, and Asera and the Blue Gate and Stella Montis, is gone. But the threat that contributed to its destruction is not. The ruins are ruins, but the thing that helped make them ruins is still active. And the knowledge to address that thing, if the research at Stella Montis found what it was looking for, if the program at Asera delivered what it intended, may be sitting in a frozen database in a mountain facility, waiting for a reader who understands what they are looking at. The archaeology of Ark Raiders' world is therefore not merely retrospective. It is not just a matter of understanding what happened to a civilization that no longer exists. It is potentially a matter of understanding what that civilization was trying to accomplish and whether the accomplishment is still within reach. The research notes, the launch records, the operational documentation scattered across these 5 locations could collectively constitute a blueprint, not for rebuilding the lost civilization, but for continuing the project it was most urgently pursuing at the moment of its collapse. The ruins are not just monuments to failure. They may also be instructions. The emotional weight of the 5 locations taken together is different from the emotional weight of any individual location. The dam alone is a story of infrastructure failure and human desperation. The buried city alone is a story of urban loss on a massive scale. Asera alone is a story of ambitious response under impossible conditions. The Blue Gate alone is a story of layered history and persistent strategic value. Stella Montis alone is a story of cold science in service of existential survival. But together, they are something more than the sum of those individual stories. Together, they are the story of a civilization that saw what was coming, understood at least something of what it was, and refused to simply accept it. The refusal was not successful in the conventional sense. The civilization still collapsed. But the evidence of the refusal is still there, in the 5 locations waiting to be read by whoever comes next. The players moving through these locations every session, extracting materials, contesting objectives and surviving arc raids, are doing more than playing a game. They are, within the fiction of the world, walking through a particular kind of history. The history of a moment when everything was at stake, and the people at those locations knew it. The dam worker who decided to stay and keep the pumps running for one more week. The city planner who organized one more district's evacuation before the sand made it impossible. The spaceport engineer who worked one more overnight shift to get the next launch vehicle ready. The mountain soldier who sat in a fortified bunker watching the sky for arc activity. The researcher who ran one more experimental series before securing the data and walking out of the laboratory for the last time. All of these people were real, within the world's fiction, and all of them were doing something that mattered. The horror within each arc map is not the horror of monsters or supernatural forces. It is the more ordinary horror of recognition. The recognition that the systems which keep life possible are fragile, that the institutions which maintain those systems are vulnerable, and that the gap between a functioning civilization and a ruined one is smaller than it looks from inside the functioning one. The dam, the buried city, Asera, the blue gate, Stella Montis. Each one is a different angle on the same fundamental story, the story of how quickly a world can change, and how much the people living through that change were willing to sacrifice to prevent the worst from happening. The worst happened anyway, but they tried. Every location in this game is evidence that they tried. The current state of these 5 locations, contested, dangerous, partially understood, and full of recoverable information, suggests that the story is not over. The collapse happened, but the collapse was not the end. Whatever was launched from Asera is still up there, or was still up there until recently. Whatever data was preserved at Stella Montis is still waiting in its cold archive. Whatever the Blue Gate was most recently used for is still encoded in its deepest caverns. Whatever the buried city's archives contain is still buried under the sand, intact and waiting for excavation. The dam's records of the water system and its failure are still readable in the facility's surviving control sections. The world of Arc Raiders is a world of recoverable knowledge, if anyone is willing and able to do the recovering. The final observation worth making about these 5 locations is about what they collectively communicate regarding the nature of the Arc threat itself. The dam shows Arc as one accelerant among many in a systemic collapse. The buried city shows Arc as one vector of destruction in a location already being destroyed by environmental change. Asera shows Arc as a threat serious enough to motivate an extraordinary space program. The Blue Gate shows Arc as a threat requiring both ground-level and sky-facing defenses. Stella Montis shows Arc as a phenomenon serious enough to require a dedicated scientific research program at the highest level of resource allocation and secrecy this civilization could provide. Each location gives you a different aspect of what Arc is: destructive force, environmental threat, motivator of extraordinary response, subject of scientific inquiry. Together they begin to define it. Not completely, not definitively, but enough to know that whatever Arc is, it is not random, it is not incidental, and it is not something that any single location or any single response was sufficient to address. The answer, if there is one, is distributed across all 5 of these ruined places, waiting. What makes that distribution of answers so significant is the deliberate nature of it. The knowledge was not scattered by accident or by the chaos of collapse. It was placed. The researchers at Stella Montis secured their archives with the intention that they would be found. The operations officers at Asera maintained communication systems with the expectation that they might still be useful. The people at the Blue Gate sealed their deepest sections, not to hide what was there forever, but to protect it until whoever came next was ready to find it. The dam's operational records were not destroyed. The buried city's institutional archives were not burned. There is a pattern across all 5 locations that points toward a consistent decision made by the people who last occupied each of them. The decision to leave the information behind, intact, protected, and recoverable. That is not the decision of people who have given up. That is the decision of people who believe that what they found out matters and that someone, eventually, will come looking for it. The question of why they did not take the information with them is worth sitting with. If the research at Stella Montis is as significant as the facility's design suggests, why not carry it out, transmit it, distribute it to multiple locations for safety? The answer this environment implies is that the distribution problem was solved, but not in the way you might expect. The information at Stella Montis was not transmitted outward. Instead, the entire chain of response, the dam's records, the buried city's institutional archives, the Asera launch documentation, the Blue Gate's operational history, and Stella Montis's research was left in place as a set that is only fully coherent if you have access to all 5 locations and the knowledge to connect what each one contains. The distributed nature of the information is not an accident or a failure of coordination. It is the security architecture of a last resort. Think about what that means practically. If you find only the Stella Montis data, you have measurements and models, but not the operational context of what was done in response to those models. If you find only the Asera records, you have the launch history, but not the scientific rationale that justified the program. If you find only the Blue Gate's operational material, you have the defensive and communications framework, but not the research that the defenses were protecting. Each piece is valuable on its own, but the full picture requires all 5. Whoever designed this system, and it is increasingly hard to look at the consistent pattern of deliberate preservation across 5 separate locations and not conclude that someone designed it, was creating something that could only be fully understood by someone willing to visit all 5 locations, extract information from each, and synthesize them into a coherent whole. The game's faction structure, when viewed in this light, takes on additional significance. If multiple factions are operating in the Ark Raiders world, and if some of those factions have an interest in understanding or controlling whatever the previous civilization was attempting, then the 5 maps are not just contested territory. They are nodes in an information network that different groups are trying to access, control, or prevent others from accessing. The conflict happening in these locations is not simply about resources or survival. It is, at least in part, about information, about who gets to know what the research at Stella Montis found, what was launched from Asera, and whether any of it is still actionable. The Ark raids continuing in the present tense of the game world are the most direct evidence that whatever the previous civilization attempted did not fully succeed. If the space program at Asera delivered a solution, the Ark raids should have stopped. They have not stopped, but the persistence of Ark activity does not necessarily mean the program failed entirely. It is possible that the program succeeded partially, that it reduced the frequency or intensity of Ark activity, or that it addressed one aspect of the Ark phenomenon while leaving others unresolved, or that it was successful but its effects are temporary, decaying over time in ways that the research at Stella Montis may have predicted. The Ark raids we see in the current game world may not be the same Ark raids the previous civilization faced. They may be what Ark looks like after someone already did something about it. The environmental evidence across the 5 locations supports a nuanced reading of the outcome. The Ark damage, visible at different locations, has different characteristics, different intensities, different patterns of impact. If Ark activity were uniform and unchanging, you would expect to see consistent signatures everywhere. Instead, the variation in Ark damage across the locations suggests either that Ark activity is not uniform, or that the locations have different characteristics that produce different interactions with Ark energy, or that the Ark phenomenon itself has changed over the time period during which these locations have been accumulating damage. Any of these possibilities is interesting. The third is perhaps the most interesting because change in the Ark phenomenon over time could be evidence that the program at Asera did something, that it altered the situation in a way that the environmental record is quietly documenting. The relationship between the arc phenomenon and human technology is one of the game's central mysteries, and the 5 locations together illuminate it from different angles. At the dam, the low-tech industrial infrastructure shows arc interaction with ordinary metals and chemicals, the basic level of the arc-matter relationship. At the buried city, the dense urban infrastructure shows how arc energy propagates through and interacts with concentrated human construction, the spatial dimension of the relationship. At Asera, the high-tech aerospace components show how arc interacts with the most sophisticated materials and systems available to this civilization, the technological frontier of the arc-matter relationship. At the Blue Gate, the layered historical infrastructure shows how different technological eras interact differently with the arc phenomenon, the historical dimension. And at Stella Montis, the scientific instruments, specifically designed to measure arc activity, give you the most controlled and interpretable view of the arc-matter relationship available anywhere in the game's world. Reading these 5 perspectives together, a picture begins to emerge of an arc phenomenon that is not simply a force that destroys things indiscriminately. The damage patterns suggest selectivity, or at least differentiation. Some materials and configurations interact more intensely with arc energy than others. Some locations experience arc activity more frequently or more severely than others, in ways that cannot be fully explained by random distribution. The research at Stella Montis was tracking exactly this kind of differentiation, trying to characterize the rules governing which things arc affects most severely and why. Whatever those rules are, they are embedded in the environmental evidence across all 5 maps, available to anyone who knows how to look. The specific question of what arc is at its fundamental physical level is one that the 5 locations together approach, but do not definitively answer. The Stella Montis research was working on this question most directly, but the approach was empirical, measuring effects and looking for patterns rather than theoretical, which means the research would have produced a detailed characterization of arc behavior without necessarily explaining the underlying mechanism. Think of it as the equivalent of accurately describing the behavior of electricity, how it flows, what conducts it, what it does to different materials, when it occurs, without having a theory of electromagnetism. The characterization is enormously useful even without the theory, because it allows prediction and management, not theoretical understanding, was almost certainly what the practical response required. This distinction between characterization and understanding matters for thinking about what comes next in the Arc Raiders world. If Stella Montis' archives contain a detailed characterization of arc behavior, the patterns, the periodicities, the material affinities, the spatial regularities, then that characterization is actionable. You do not need to understand why arc does what it does in order to use the patterns to predict where and when it will happen next, or to design materials and infrastructure that interact with it more advantageously, or to position orbital assets to interfere with arc events before they reach the ground. The research is useful even if it is incomplete, perhaps especially if it is incomplete, because complete theoretical understanding would take decades more work that the people at Stella Montis did not have. They gave future users a tool they could apply before they fully understood why it worked. Returning to the individual locations with this lens, the idea that each site is a node in a deliberately distributed information system reveals new details that are easy to miss on a first pass. At the dam, the operational records take on additional significance. Water treatment is one of the most data-rich industrial processes in existence, generating continuous measurements of flow rates, chemical concentrations, treatment efficacy, and environmental conditions. Those records, if the dam's operational period coincided with the onset of arc activity in the region, would contain some of the earliest systematic measurements of arc effects on ground-level water and atmospheric chemistry. The dam's records may be the baseline dataset, the before and after measurements that allow everything else to be calibrated. The buried city's institutional records, buried under the sand, are potentially the largest single archive available to any faction in the Arc Raiders world. A city of that size would have generated enormous quantities of administrative, scientific, commercial, and cultural records. Among those records, the ones most relevant to understanding the Arc situation would be the city's public health records. The baseline health data, that would show, over time, the cumulative effects of arc-related environmental changes on a large urban population, and the city's infrastructure management records, which would document the precise sequence and nature of systems failures as the collapse progressed. Both sets of records would allow extraordinarily precise reconstruction of the timeline and mechanism of collapse in a way that the individual facility records at the other locations cannot. Asera's records are perhaps the most immediately actionable of any location, because they connect to whatever is still in orbit. If anything launched from Asera remains operational, remains accessible, remains responsive to commands, then the launch records and communication protocols at Asera are the keys to accessing it. The communication systems at Asera were designed to maintain a link to something specific, and the people who designed those systems anticipated that the link might need to be re-established after a period of non-use. The systems were built with restart procedures, with authentication protocols designed for the contingency of a new operator who could be verified without requiring them to know the old operator's specific credentials. The spaceport's communication infrastructure, in other words, was designed to be used by whoever came next, not just by the people who were there originally. The Blue Gate's deep cavern contents remain the most uncertain of all 5 locations. The deliberate sealing of those sections before the facility's final abandonment is consistent with the overall pattern of intentional preservation, but the nature of what is being preserved there is less obvious than at the other locations. Scientific data, launch records, operational protocols, these are straightforwardly valuable as information. What the Blue Gate's deepest sections contain is implied to be something different in kind, not simply more data, but something more physical, more direct. The decontamination and containment protocols, evident in the path to those deepest sections, suggest that whatever is down there is not a passive archive. It is something that requires the same kind of careful handling protocols that the Stella montis samples required. The connection between the Blue Gate's deepest contents and the Stella montis research programs is therefore one of the most significant unexplored threads in the Ark Raiders world. If Stella montis was generating Ark-related materials and samples through its experimental work, and if those materials required handling protocols that made long-term storage at Stella montis itself inadvisable, then the most logical destination for those materials would be a secure location with appropriate containment infrastructure nearby. The Blue Gate, with its deep, cool, naturally shielded caverns and its extensive containment infrastructure, is exactly the kind of secondary storage location that a research program generating hazardous novel materials would need. The Blue Gate may not just be a military installation that happened to be near a research facility. It may be the secure archive for the most sensitive material products of the Stella montis program. What those materials are, what Ark-associated samples look like in physical form, what properties they have, what hazards they present, is a question that the 5 maps together raise but leave suspended. The safety infrastructure at Stella montis and the implied containment at the Blue Gate both point toward materials with unusual properties that conventional containment partially but not entirely manages. The decontamination protocols suggest something that can transfer from a sample to an environment or from a sample to a person in ways that require active management rather than simple physical isolation. This is a profile consistent with materials that carry some form of the Ark energy signature within them, that are in a sense still partly Ark, still carrying something of the phenomenon that produced them. If that characterization is correct, then the players and factions moving through the Blue Gate are operating in the vicinity of materials that are not simply passive industrial hazards. They are in the vicinity of what might be the most concentrated and accessible samples of the Ark phenomenon available anywhere in the game's world. The horror within the Blue Gate is not the horror of ancient ruins or mysterious history. It is the more immediate horror of proximity to something that is still, in some residual but real sense, active. The Ark Raiders themselves, the player characters, the factions, the scavengers and fighters who populate all 5 of these locations, occupy an interesting position in the narrative of the world. They are descendants of the collapse, operating in the ruins of a civilization that tried and failed to solve its central problem. But they are also, whether they know it or not, the people that the previous civilization was counting on. The deliberate preservation of information across all 5 locations was done with the expectation that someone would come. The authentication systems at Asera that allow new operators to re-establish the communication link were designed for whoever came next. The data archives at Stella montis were configured for recovery by people who might not have the original researcher's context, but who could work with the data if they had access to it. The previous civilization left a job to be finished, and the people in the ruins are the ones who are in a position, if they choose to take it, to finish it. The irony of this situation is not lost in the game's environmental storytelling. The people who are most consistently present in these locations, the raiders, the scavengers, the faction operatives, are largely focused on immediate survival and resource extraction. They are not, in their day-to-day operations, engaged in the project of recovering and synthesizing the information distributed across the 5 sites. They are fighting over metal and ammunition, and whatever else the ruins yield that has immediate practical value. The world-saving information sitting in the archives and communication systems of these locations is not for most people in the current game world a priority. Staying alive through the next Ark raid is the priority. Understanding the Ark raids can wait until you have enough to eat and somewhere safe to sleep. This gap between immediate survival priorities and the longer-term strategic significance of the location's informational content is one of the things that makes the Ark Raiders world feel genuinely lived in. Post-collapse societies do not organize themselves around their predecessors' research programs. They organize themselves around food, water, shelter, and security. The fact that the previous civilization embedded its most important knowledge in locations that are now contested for entirely different reasons is a realistic feature of how information survives, and often fails to survive, through periods of civilizational collapse. The specific faction or individual who first manages to connect all 5 locations as an integrated system, to extract the relevant information from each, and to use that information purposefully, would occupy an extraordinary position in the Ark Raiders world. They would possess something that no single scavenging operation or factional conflict could produce: a coherent understanding of what the previous civilization was attempting, what it achieved, and what resources it left available for continuation. Whether that understanding could actually be translated into effective action against the Ark phenomenon is uncertain. The research was incomplete. The launches were made without knowing if they succeeded. The materials in the Blue Gate caverns have unknown properties, but a coherent understanding, built from all 5 locations, would be vastly more actionable than anything available from any single location. And the person or faction that assembled it would know more about the Ark situation than anyone alive had known since Stella montis was last operational. The horror within each Ark map, returned to now at the conclusion of this survey, reveals itself in layers. The surface horror is the environmental one. The decay, the ruin, the evidence of catastrophic systems failure. The next layer is the human horror, the evidence of lives interrupted, communities destroyed, institutional efforts that ultimately fell short. But the deepest layer is the cognitive horror of recognition. Looking at these 5 locations and understanding what they collectively represent: the dam meant to sustain life, the city built for millions, the spaceport aimed at the sky, the mountain fortress built over centuries, the cold laboratory where some of the best minds of a civilization worked on its hardest problem, and knowing that all of it was not enough, and that the thing that was not stopped is still happening above your head as you walk through the ruins. That is the horror within the Ark maps, not the ruins themselves. The fact that what made them ruins has not gone away. Each visit to any of these locations is therefore a double experience: the immediate tactical reality of extraction and survival, and the deeper narrative reality of what each location was and what it failed to prevent. The dam is not just cover and objectives. It is the water supply of a dead city. The buried city is not just rooftops and plazas. It is where hundreds of thousands of people tried to live and could not. Asera is not just hangars and runways. It is where the last serious attempt to fix the problem was launched. The Blue Gate is not just a tactical environment with multiple elevation levels. It is 1,000 years of human effort to hold one mountain pass, made more complicated by the specific horror of whatever is sealed in its deepest caverns. And Stella montis is not just a vertical map with laboratory aesthetics. It is the closest thing this world's civilization came to understanding what was destroying it, sitting frozen in the dark, waiting. The arc that continues to fall on all of these locations, in the present tense of the game, is therefore not falling on empty ruins. It is falling on answers. Every arc raid that hits the Stella Montes facility is one more event layering on top of the data that the facility was built to collect. Every raid that further damages the Asera communication infrastructure makes the link to whatever is in orbit harder to re-establish. Every raid that collapses more of the buried city's buried sections buries its archives more deeply. The arc phenomenon is, whether intentionally or coincidentally, continuing to obscure the very evidence that was gathered to understand it. The ruins are being made ruiner, the answers are being made harder to reach, and the people who might be able to do something about it are too busy surviving the next raid to go looking. That tension between what needs to be done and what survival demands is the beating heart of the Arc Raiders world, embedded in every location, legible in every ruin, present in every moment you spend moving through these 5 extraordinary spaces. The maps are not settings, they are arguments. Each one argues, in the specific language of its architecture and its history and its particular form of ruin, for the same proposition, that this world's story is not finished, that the last chapter of this civilization's attempt to address its crisis has not been written, that the information is still there, the communication link is still waiting to be re-established, the materials are still sealed in the mountain, and the cold archive still holds its conclusions in the dark. The only question is whether anyone is going to do anything about it, and that question, whether anyone is going to do anything about it, is not an abstract one in the context of the game's world. It is a question with a specific answer, depending on which faction you align with, which information you have managed to recover, and which of the 5 locations you have spent enough time in to understand what they are actually offering. The factions of Arc Raiders are not simply competing for territory and resources in a general sense. They are, knowingly or not, making choices about the future of this world's relationship with the Arc phenomenon. Every decision about which location to prioritize, which archive to access, which communication system to attempt to restore, is a decision that moves the world toward or away from the resolution of the central problem that all 5 maps document. The raider identity itself is interesting in this context. The word raider carries connotations of opportunism, of taking without contributing, of being outside the systems and institutions of organized society. In most games, raiders are the obstacle, the threat that the protagonist overcomes. In Arc Raiders, the raiders are the protagonists. The people moving through these ruins, fighting for survival and extraction, are the ones the previous civilization's last acts were designed to reach. The authentication systems at Asera, the recoverable archives at Stella Montes, the accessible but sealed sections of the Blue Gate, all of these were designed with the assumption that the people who came next would not be the same kind of people who built the facilities. They would be different, operating under different conditions, with different capabilities and different knowledge. But they would be people, and they would be present, and that was considered sufficient. The specific design choices visible at each location that point toward this intended future recovery are worth cataloguing before this survey closes. At the dam, the operational records are stored in locations that were protected from the flooding that took over much of the facility, elevated, sealed, and in materials that resist water damage. This is not accidental. Someone decided, before leaving, to ensure that the most important records would survive the flooding that they presumably knew was coming. At the buried city, certain institutional archives appear to have been moved below ground before the evacuation was complete, placed in locations protected from the sand that was already beginning to accumulate. At Asera, the communication system's restart protocols were documented and stored separately from the main operational records, in a format and location suggesting they were intended as a standalone resource for a future operator. At the Blue Gate, the access sequence for the sealed lower sections was distributed, not held by a single keeper, but encoded into the facility's architecture in a way that a sufficiently observant and persistent investigator could reconstruct. And at Stella Montes, the archives organization was designed for external users, with a finding aid, with cross-references, with the kind of documentation structure that a librarian rather than a researcher would design, intended to help someone unfamiliar with the program navigate the material efficiently. These details, taken together, paint a portrait of people who were not simply trying to preserve their work for its own sake. They were trying to make their work usable by people they would never meet, in circumstances they could not fully predict, under conditions that might be significantly worse than anything they had personally experienced. The effort required to do this, to think about future recovery as seriously as you think about current research, to document not just your findings but your methodology and your organizational structure in terms a stranger can follow, is a form of generosity that goes beyond ordinary institutional behavior. This was people spending their final days in a functioning civilization, making sure that the next people to arrive, whoever they were, would have what they needed. The emotional texture of that decision is worth sitting with for a moment. These were not abstract institutional actors making impersonal choices about information management. They were individuals, scientists and engineers, and military personnel and administrators who had spent years or decades working in these locations, who understood better than anyone what was at stake and what had been accomplished. They were leaving, or in some cases staying until they could no longer stay, and in their final acts at each facility, they were choosing to think about the future rather than the present, not their own future, which the circumstances presumably made uncertain at best. The future of whoever came next. That choice is visible in the 5 locations, encoded in the specific decisions they made before the lights went out. The broader world of Ark Raiders beyond these 5 specific locations presumably contains other sites, other ruins, other facilities, other evidence of the previous civilization's extended response to the Ark crisis. The 5 maps covered in this video are a selection, not a comprehensive survey, but they are the most significant selection available, both because of what each one individually represents and because of how they relate to each other. The Dam, the Buried City, Asera the Blue Gate, and Stella Montis form a coherent set precisely because they represent the full spectrum of the civilization's response: infrastructure, population, space program, defense, and science. Whatever other locations exist in this world, these 5 are the nodes of the response network. They are the places that mattered most, to the people who mattered most, when it mattered most. Understanding them fully, not just tactically, not just as game environments, but as narrative spaces with specific histories and specific roles in a larger story, changes how you experience every moment you spend in them. The next time you cross the flooded lower sections of the dam, you are not just crossing an obstacle, you are walking through the contaminated remnants of a water supply system that served a city of hundreds of thousands, that was maintained by people who understood what would happen if it failed, and that failed anyway. The next time you fight across the sand-buried rooftops of the buried city, you are not just fighting across a map, you are fighting in the highest surviving sections of a metropolis that was designed for human flourishing, and that the combination of environmental change, arc activity, and institutional collapse turned into geology. The next time you move through the vast empty runways of Asera, you are not just moving through open ground, you are moving across surfaces built for machines that were aimed at solving the problem that is still killing people above your head. The horror within the Ark maps is real, and it is worth the attention. Not the horror of fictional monsters or invented supernatural threats, but the quieter, more durable horror of recognizing what these places were and measuring that against what they are. That measurement is the emotional core of the Ark Raiders world, and it is what makes these locations more than just game environments. They are arguments, as I said earlier, but they are also memorials. They memorialize a civilization's serious, sustained, and ultimately insufficient attempt to address a threat that was larger than any single facility, any single program, or any single generation could fully contain. The attempt is over. The threat continues, and the evidence of both is sitting in the ruins, waiting for the right people to find it. The story this video has traced, from the decaying industrial infrastructure of the dam, through the sand-consumed streets of the buried city, across the vast, desolate surfaces of Asera, up into the layered historical complexity of the Blue Gate, and finally into the cold scientific corridors of Stella Montis, is a story about a world that did not give up easily. The ruins are not evidence of passivity or resignation. They are evidence of effort, of enormous, sustained, coordinated effort across multiple institutional domains and multiple geographic locations, directed at the hardest problem this civilization faced. The effort failed, in the sense that the civilization is gone, and the arc raids continue. But the evidence of the effort is intact, and that matters. It matters because the evidence of the effort is also the evidence of the solution, or at least the closest approximation to a solution that this world's best minds could construct. The data at Stella Montis, the launch records at Asera, the communication systems waiting for a new operator, the sealed sections of the Blue Gate, the buried archives of the buried city, the baseline measurements at the dam, all of these together constitute a legacy, not the legacy of success, but the legacy of the most serious attempt this world made to understand and address the arc phenomenon. That legacy is available to anyone willing to look for it, in the right places, with the right understanding of what they are looking at. The arc phenomenon itself, the silent protagonist of this entire narrative, deserves a final consideration. Throughout this survey, the arc has been treated as a threat, a force, a phenomenon to be studied and potentially countered. But the 5 locations also suggest another way of thinking about it. The arc is not simply destructive, it is in some sense selective. It interacts differently with different materials, different technologies, different locations. It has patterns, regularities, cycles that the research at Stella Montis was trying to characterize. It responds to some things and ignores others. This is not the behavior of random destruction. It is the behavior of something with rules, however incomprehensible those rules may be to the people living under them. And rules, however incomprehensible, are the beginning of understanding. The researchers at Stella Montis understood this. The engineers at Asera understood this, in their own domain. The strategists at the Blue Gate understood this. In the military context at the dam understood this. In the context of environmental chemistry, even the urban planners of the buried city, in their last frantic months, appear to have understood that the arc phenomenon had patterns that could inform decisions about where to shelter and when to move. The 5 locations are, in this reading, 5 different disciplines, all working on the same problem through the lens of their own expertise. The dam's contribution is environmental. The buried cities is demographic and logistical. Asera's is engineering and operational. The Blue Gates is strategic and possibly experimental. Stella Montis is scientific and archival. None of these perspectives alone is sufficient. Together, they might be. Whether that sufficiency can be realized, whether someone in the current Arc Raiders world can assemble the complete picture, understand what was attempted, evaluate how close it came to succeeding, and determine what would be needed to finish the job, is the open question that the 5 maps collectively leave hanging. It is not a comfortable open question. The stakes are as high as they get. The information is scattered, degraded, and protected by the ordinary hazards of contested ruin environments. The factions that might have the motivation to pursue it are also competing with each other in ways that complicate coordination. And the arc raids continue, making every visit to every location a risk, degrading the archives a little more with every event, pushing the possibility of successful recovery a little further from reach. The 5 maps of Arc Raiders are, in the end, a puzzle that was designed to be solved, distributed across a world that was not designed to make solving it easy. The designers of the puzzle, the last people at each location, doing their best to leave something useful behind, knew this. They designed for difficulty, for extended timelines, for recovery by people who would not have the context that the original researchers and operators had. They designed for something harder than any of them personally experienced, because they understood that whoever came next would have less to work with and more to overcome. They designed for the players of this game, whether they knew it or not. And the game, in its environmental storytelling, is making the case that the puzzle is worth solving. That case is made not through dialogue or cutscenes or explicit narrative exposition. It is made through 5 carefully designed locations, each of which communicates its specific piece of the story through the specific details of its physical environment. The corroded pipes of the dam, the sand-filled plaza of the buried city, the scarred launch pad of Asera, the ancient stone walls threaded with modern sensor cables at the Blue Gate, the sterile laboratory corridors of Stella Montis. Each detail is a sentence in a very long story being told without words, to anyone willing to slow down enough to read it. This video has been an attempt to read it, to take the individual sentences and assemble them into the paragraphs and chapters of a coherent narrative. Not the only possible reading, The lore of Ark Raiders is sufficiently open that multiple interpretations are valid, but a reading that takes the environmental evidence seriously, that treats the design choices of each location as meaningful rather than decorative, and that tries to honor the ambition of the storytelling by engaging with it at the same level of seriousness with which it was made. These locations were designed by people who cared about what they were communicating. This video was made by someone who noticed and wanted other people to notice too. The 5 locations are not finished with their stories. Every Ark raid adds new damage and new evidence. Every faction operation adds new occupation layers and new traces of human presence. Every player who moves through these environments and pays attention to what they contain is in a small way continuing the archaeological work that the ruins are inviting. The story of Ark Raiders is not told in a single playthrough or a single video. It accumulates, like the rust on the dam's machinery, like the sand in the buried city's streets, like the cold that has settled permanently into the corridors of Stella montis. Slowly, layer by layer, detail by detail, the full picture becomes available to anyone patient enough to keep looking. The horror within is still there. It does not resolve. The Ark still falls. The ruins are still ruins. The archives are still waiting. But the looking, the sustained and serious looking at what these places are and what they represent, that is not nothing. That is, in the context of this world's story, the most important thing anyone can do. Look at what was left behind, understand what it means, and consider, seriously, what it would take to finish the job that the people at these 5 locations started and could not complete. The dam, the buried city, Asera, the Blue Gate, Stella montis. 5 locations, 1 story, still unfinished. The unfinished quality of the story is not a failure of the game's world building. It is a feature of it. Games that tell you everything they know about their worlds are games that have finished their conversations with you. Ark Raiders has not finished its conversation. The 5 maps are the opening of that conversation, not the conclusion. And the specific way each location withholds its final answers while offering its intermediate ones is a form of narrative respect. The game treats you as someone capable of holding uncertainty, of sitting with an incomplete picture and continuing to engage with it rather than demanding resolution. That treatment is earned by the quality of what each location offers before it runs out of legible evidence. You are given enough to understand why you want more, and not quite enough to feel satisfied with what you have. The dam offers enough to understand the systemic failure of essential infrastructure, but it does not tell you when the last maintenance worker left, or what they said before they went, or whether they believed anyone would come back. The buried city offers enough to understand the scale of the urban loss and the organized nature of the departure, but it does not tell you where the people went, or whether the evacuation destination survived, or whether the families who left the playgrounds behind ever found a new home. Asera offers enough to understand the ambition and the secrecy of the space program, but it does not tell you what the launch is achieved, or whether anything is still operational in orbit, or whether the people who designed the restart protocols ever imagined someone would actually use them. The Blue Gate offers enough to understand the layers of its history and the unusual nature of its deepest contents, but it does not tell you what those contents actually are, or what they were expected to do, or what would happen if containment were compromised. And Stella montis offers enough to understand the scientific seriousness of the Ark research program, but it does not tell you what the final conclusions were, or whether the orbital program they informed had the effect that the models predicted, or whether the researchers considered their work a success before they sealed the archive and walked away. These specific gaps are not random. Each withheld answer is the answer that would close the story if it were given, and the story is not supposed to close. The dam's missing answer about the last worker is the human scale of the systemic failure. The buried city's missing answer about the evacuee's destination is the fate of the ordinary population. Asera's missing answer about orbital status is the fate of the response program. The Blue Gate's missing answer about the sealed contents is the nature of the most direct Ark-related material evidence. Stella montis's missing answer about the final conclusions is the state of human understanding of the Ark phenomenon.